The smell of smoke never leaves a man. It clings to memory like a ghost, seeping into dreams, threading through every waking thought. Caleb Vance knew that smell. It had been 7 years since the fire, and still, on certain nights when the wind came from the east, he swore he could taste it, ash and timber, skin and sorrow. He sat now on the edge of a dusty ridge overlooking Ember Flats, a town that had no right to exist and every reason to die. Below him, lanterns flickered in windows like dying stars. Somewhere down there, a piano played out of tune. Somewhere else, a woman laughed too loud, trying to drown out the silence that came after. Caleb didn't ride into towns like this anymore. Not unless he had to. But tonight, he had to. The bounty notice was folded in his coat pocket. A man named Dutch Harrow, wanted for murder and theft across 3 territories. The reward was $200, enough to keep Caleb moving for another month, maybe 2, enough to keep him from thinking too long about the past. He nudged his horse forward, a gray mare with a scarred flank and patience to match his own. The trail down was steep, loose gravel crunching beneath hooves. As they descended, the noise of the town grew louder, shouts, the crack of a whip, the low rumble of wagon wheels on rutted earth. Ember Flats had grown since he'd last seen it. New storefronts lined the main street, their paint fresh and bright against the weathered wood of older buildings. A general store. A butcher. A saloon with swinging doors that never stopped swinging, and at the far end of the street, rising like a monument to something long dead, stood the church. Caleb's jaw tightened. It wasn't the same church. That one had burned. But someone, some fool with hope still flickering in their chest, had rebuilt it. Same white walls, same crooked steeple, same cross perched on top like a question mark aimed at heaven. He looked away. The saloon was where men like Dutch Harrow ended up. Men running from the law didn't hide in daylight. They buried themselves in whiskey and shadow, waiting for the world to forget them. Caleb tied his horse to the post outside and stepped through the doors. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and tobacco. A dozen men sat scattered across tables, cards, and coins spread between them. In the corner, a woman in a faded dress sang a song no one was listening to. Behind the bar, a man with a gut like a beer barrel wiped down glasses that would never be clean. Caleb's eyes swept the room. Third table from the back. A man in a black coat, hat pulled low, one hand resting on the table, the other hidden beneath it. His posture was wrong, too stiff, too ready. He wasn't drinking. He was waiting. Caleb walked to the bar. "Whiskey," he said. The bartender poured without looking up. "You new in town?" "Passing through." "Figures." The bartender slid the glass across the counter. "Most folks are." Caleb took the drink but didn't taste it. He watched the mirror behind the bar, tracking the man in the black coat. The man's eyes flicked toward him once, then away. Recognition. Fear. Calculation. Caleb set the glass down and turned. "Dutch Harrow." The name cut through the noise like a blade. The piano stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye in the room turned toward the man at the third table. Dutch didn't move. "You got the wrong man, friend." "I don't have friends," Caleb said. "And I don't make mistakes." Dutch's hand twitched beneath the table. Caleb saw it. The shift of fabric, the tightening of knuckles. He'd done this dance 100 times before. It always ended the same way. $200, Caleb said. "Dead or alive? Your choice." For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Dutch lunged. The table flipped. Cards and coins exploded into the air. Dutch's gun came up fast, but Caleb was faster. His hand moved like instinct, drawing the revolver from his hip and firing in one smooth motion. The shot cracked through the saloon. Dutch staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and wet. He dropped to his knees, gasping. Caleb holstered his weapon and walked over. He kicked the gun away, then grabbed Dutch by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "You're coming with me." Dutch spat blood. "You think you're some kind of hero?" "No," Caleb said. "I know exactly what I am." He dragged Dutch toward the door. No one tried to stop him. No one ever did. Outside, the street was quieter now. A few faces peered from windows, curious but cautious. Caleb shoved Dutch against the hitching post and bound his wrists with rope. "They'll hang you for this," Dutch muttered. "They'll hang you first." Caleb mounted his horse and pulled Dutch along behind him. The nearest marshal's office was 2 days' ride east, 2 days of silence and dust and the weight of a man's life dragging behind him like an anchor. As they rode out of Ember Flats, Caleb glanced back one last time. The church stood tall against the darkening sky, its white walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. He looked away. The marshal's office in Ridgeway was a squat, ugly building that smelled like piss and old paper. Caleb handed Dutch over without ceremony, collected his $200, and left before the marshal could ask questions he didn't want to answer. He spent the night in a boarding house that charged too much and offered too little. The bed was hard, the walls thin, and sleep came in pieces, fractured and sharp, full of dreams he couldn't shake. Fire, screaming, the sound of splintering wood. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his hand already reaching for the gun on the nightstand. The room was empty. Silent. Safe. But the smell of smoke was still there. Caleb dressed quickly and stepped outside. The town was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers sweeping stoops, children chasing each other through alleys, a dog barking at nothing. He walked to the edge of town and stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon. He didn't know where he was going. He never did. The frontier was endless, and so was his wandering. But something pulled him west, something he couldn't name. 3 weeks later, Caleb found himself on the outskirts of Ember Flats again. He hadn't planned it. The road had simply led him here, winding through valleys and over ridges until the town appeared below him like a scar on the land. But something was different. Smoke rose from the eastern edge of town, not the wild, consuming smoke of a fire, but the steady plume of cook fires and work. Caleb frowned and nudged his horse forward. As he rode closer, he saw them. Settlers. 24 families, maybe more, camped on a stretch of flat land just outside town. Wagons circled like a fortress. Children ran barefoot through the dirt. Women hung laundry on lines strung between trees. Men worked with hammers and saws, building frames for homes that didn't exist yet. Caleb slowed his horse and watched. They were building something. Something permanent. A man approached, tall, lean, with a sun-weathered face and hands calloused from labor. He wore no gun, just a simple shirt and trousers, and his eyes held the kind of quiet determination Caleb hadn't seen in years. "Help you, friend?" the man asked. "Just passing through," Caleb said. The man nodded but didn't move. "Name's Thomas Reed. These are my people." "Your people?" "Settlers. We bought this land fair and square, paid cash to the land office in Silver Creek, got the deed signed and stamped." Thomas gestured toward the half-built frames. "We're building a community here, a place where folks can live honest and free." Caleb glanced toward the town. "Does Ember Flats know you're here?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "They know." "And?" "And they're not happy about it." Caleb didn't need to ask why. Land meant power, and power in a place like Ember Flats meant control. Whoever ran this town wouldn't let a group of settlers just walk in and claim a piece of it, not without a fight. "You carrying?" Caleb asked. Thomas shook his head. "We don't believe in violence." Caleb almost laughed. "Almost." "Then you're already dead." Thomas's expression didn't change. "We believe in the law. We've got the deeds. We've got the right. That's all we need." "The law doesn't matter out here," Caleb said. "Only strength does." "Then maybe it's time the law started mattering again." Caleb studied the man for a long moment. There was no fear in his eyes, no doubt. Just conviction, pure and stubborn and dangerous in its own way. "Good luck," Caleb said, and rode past. He found a room at the same boarding house he'd stayed in months ago. The owner didn't recognize him, which suited Caleb fine. He paid for 3 nights and kept to himself. But the settler stayed on his mind. He'd seen this before. Not here, not exactly, but close enough. Good people trying to carve out a life in a place that didn't want them. And every time, it ended the same way. Blood, fire. Graves dug too shallow because there were too many to bury. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself to move on, collect another bounty, keep drifting. But that night, he dreamed again. The church, the flames, the screams. And when he woke, he knew he couldn't leave. That The next morning, Caleb rode out to the settlers' camp. Thomas was there, working alongside a group of men to raise the frame of a house. They worked in silence, their movements coordinated, efficient. Caleb dismounted and walked over. Thomas looked up, surprised. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "Neither did I." Thomas set down his hammer. "What brings you back?" Caleb hesitated. He wasn't good at this, at talking, at explaining himself. Words felt clumsy in his mouth, too small for the weight they carried. "You said you believe in the law," Caleb said finally. "I do." "The law won't save you." Thomas frowned. "Then what will?" Caleb looked past him, toward the unfinished homes, the families gathered around cook-fires, the children playing in the dirt. "I don't know," he said, "but I've seen what happens when people like you stand alone against people like them. It doesn't end well." Thomas crossed his arms. "You think we should just leave?" "I think you should be ready for what's coming." "We are ready," Thomas said. "We're ready to stand our ground, peacefully, lawfully." Caleb shook his head. "That won't be enough." "It has to be." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of hammers and saws filling the space between them. Finally, Thomas spoke. "You ever been married, Mr. Vance? Caleb Vance?" He paused. "And yeah, I was." "Children?" Caleb's throat tightened. "A daughter." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then you know. You know what it's like to want something better for the people you love. A place to call home. A future worth building." Caleb said nothing. "That's all we want," Thomas continued. "Just a chance. Just a fair shot at something good." Caleb looked at him, really looked at him. At the hope in his eyes, the belief that the world could be better if people just tried hard enough. It was the same hope Caleb had once carried, and it had burned with everything else. "Keep your eyes open," Caleb said quietly, "and don't trust anyone in that town." Thomas extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." Caleb didn't take it. He mounted his horse and rode back toward Ember Flats without another word. The saloon was busier that night. Men crowded around tables, their voices loud and slurred. Caleb sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey he didn't want, watching. He recognized some of the faces. Drifters, hired guns, the kind of men who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. And at the center of it all, standing at the bar with a cigar in one hand and a glass in the other, was a man Caleb had seen before. Elias Greer. He was older now, grayer, but still carried himself like a king surveying his kingdom. He wore a tailored coat, polished boots, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Caleb's hand tightened around his glass. Greer was the land baron who controlled Ember Flats, who controlled everything within 100 miles. He owned the saloon, the general store, half the houses in town. And he didn't get rich by playing fair. Caleb watched as Greer leaned in close to one of the hired guns, whispering something that made the man grin. Then Greer's eyes swept the room and landed on Caleb. For a moment, neither moved. Then Greer smiled and raised his glass in a mock salute. Caleb didn't respond. Greer drained his drink and walked over, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Caleb Vance," Greer said, his voice smooth as oil. "Didn't expect to see you back in Ember Flats." "I'm just passing through." That's what they all say. Greer pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "You know, I heard about that bounty you brought in. Dutch Harrow, nasty piece of work." He was. $200, wasn't it? Greer leaned back, studying Caleb. "You could make a lot more than that if you worked for me." "I don't work for anyone," Greer chuckled. "Everyone works for someone, Vance. The only question is who pays better." Caleb met his gaze. "I'm not interested." Greer's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Suit yourself. But let me give you some advice, free of charge." He leaned forward. "Those settlers camped outside town. They're not welcome here, and if they don't leave soon, things are going to get ugly." "That a threat?" "Just a fact." Greer stood and straightened his coat. "You seem like a smart man, Vance. Smart enough to know when to mind your own business." He walked away, leaving Caleb alone with his whiskey and the weight of a choice he wasn't ready to make. 2 days later, the first shot was fired. Caleb heard it from the boarding house, a sharp crack echoing across the valley. He grabbed his gun and ran outside. Smoke rose from the settlers' camp. He saddled his horse and rode hard, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, chaos greeted him. One of the wagons was on fire, flames licking at the canvas cover. Women screamed, pulling children away from the blaze. Men ran with buckets of water trying to douse the flames. And in the center of it all, lying face down in the dirt, was Thomas Reed. Caleb dismounted and pushed through the crowd. He dropped to his knees beside Thomas and rolled him over. Blood soaked the front of Thomas's shirt, spreading dark and wet across the fabric. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, but he was still breathing, barely. "Get a doctor!" Caleb shouted. "There's no doctor," someone said. "Not for us." Caleb pressed his hand against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Thomas's breath came in shallow gasps, each one weaker than the last. "Who did this?" Caleb demanded. Thomas's lips moved, but no sound came out. "Who?" Caleb repeated, leaning closer. "Greer," Thomas whispered. "Greer's men." His eyes fluttered closed. "Thomas!" Caleb shook him, but there was no response. A woman fell to her knees beside them, sobbing. "No, no, please." Caleb stood slowly, his hands covered in blood. Around him the settlers stared in stunned silence. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows across the camp. Caleb looked toward Ember Flats, toward the lights glowing in the distance. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt rage. That night, Caleb sat alone outside the camp, staring into the darkness. Thomas Reed was dead. The settlers had buried him at sunset, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross. His wife had stood silent through the whole thing, her face blank, her eyes hollow. Caleb knew that look. He'd worn it himself once. The camp was quiet now. No fires. No voices. Just the sound of wind moving through the grass. He thought about leaving. He thought about saddling his horse and riding until Ember Flats was just another name on a map, another place he'd never see again. But Thomas's words echoed in his mind. "You know what it's like to want something better for the people you love." Caleb closed his eyes. He saw his wife's face, his daughter's smile, the church where they'd died, and he saw Elias Greer standing at the bar with that smug, untouchable smile. Caleb opened his eyes. He stood and walked back to his horse. From his saddlebag, he pulled out his revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. It would be enough. He mounted his horse and rode toward Ember Flats. The town was quiet when he arrived. Most of the windows were dark, the streets empty. Only the saloon still glowed with light, music, and laughter spilling out into the night. Caleb tied his horse and stepped inside. The room fell silent as he entered. Greer sat at his usual spot at the bar, flanked by 2 hired guns. He looked up as Caleb approached, his expression amused. "Back so soon?" Greer said. "I thought you were just passing through." Caleb stopped a few feet away. "Thomas Reed is dead." "Is he?" Greer took a sip of his drink. "Shame. He seemed like a good man." "Your men killed him." Greer set down his glass. "That's a serious accusation, Vance. You got proof?" "I don't need proof." Greer laughed. "Then you've got nothing." Caleb's hand moved to his gun. The hired guns tensed, their hands hovering near their own weapons. Greer held up a hand. "Easy, boys. Mr. Vance here is just upset. He'll calm down." "I'm done calming down," Caleb said. Greer's smile faded. "You really want to do this? You really want to start a war over a bunch of squatters who don't even belong here? They bought that land. They have the deeds. Deeds don't mean anything if no one's around to enforce them." Greer leaned forward. "You know how this works, Vance. The strong survive. The weak get swept away. That's the way it's always been." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not this time." Greer sighed. "Then you're a fool." He nodded to his men. They drew. Caleb was faster. His first shot caught the man on the left in the chest, dropping him instantly. His second shot hit the man on the right in the shoulder, spinning him around. Greer dove behind the bar as chaos erupted. Men scrambled for cover, shouting, overturning tables. Caleb fired again, the bullet splintering the wood above Greer's head. "You're a dead man, Vance," Greer shouted from behind the bar. Caleb reloaded and walked forward. "So are you." But before he could reach the bar, the saloon doors burst open. A marshal stood in the doorway, gun drawn. Drop your weapon. Caleb froze. The marshal stepped inside, his eyes hard. I said drop it. Slowly, Caleb lowered his gun and set it on the floor. The marshal kicked it away and grabbed Caleb's arm, twisting it behind his back. You're under arrest. Greer emerged from behind the bar, brushing dust from his coat. He looked at Caleb and smiled. I told you, Greer said. Everyone works for someone. The marshal dragged Caleb toward the door, and as they stepped outside, Caleb looked back one last time. The church stood in the distance, its white walls glowing in the moonlight. He looked away. The jail cell smelled like rot and resignation. Caleb sat on the edge of a wooden bench bolted to the stone wall, his wrists bruised from the iron shackles they'd clamped on him during the ride from the saloon. The marshal had said nothing the entire way, just shoved him into the cell and locked the door with a finality that echoed through the small building. Now, in the dim light filtering through a barred window high above, Caleb stared at his hands. Thomas Reed's blood had dried beneath his fingernails, dark and accusing. He'd failed. Again. The thought settled into his chest like a stone. He'd come back to Ember Flats telling himself he was just passing through, that the settlers weren't his problem, that he'd learned his lesson about getting involved. But Thomas Reed's face, the quiet determination, the stubborn hope, had reminded him of something he'd buried 7 years ago. The belief that good people deserved a chance. And now Thomas was dead, and Caleb was locked in a cage while Elias Greer walked free. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Caleb looked up as the marshal appeared, keys jangling at his belt. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s with a face carved from hard years and harder choices. His badge was tarnished, but he wore it like armor. Marshal Doyle, Caleb said flatly. Doyle stopped outside the cell, studying him through the bars. You know who I am? I know enough. Doyle crossed his arms. Then you know I don't tolerate gunfights in my town. Your town, Caleb repeated. That's what you call it? I keep the peace here. Whose peace? Doyle's jaw tightened. You got something to say, Vance. Say it. Caleb stood slowly, walking to the bars. Thomas Reed was murdered in cold blood, shot down in front of his wife and children, and you didn't do a damn thing about it. I wasn't there. You didn't have to be. You know who gave the order. Doyle's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or just exhaustion. You don't know anything about what goes on here. I know Elias Greer runs this town like his own kingdom. I know he decides who lives, who dies, who gets to stay, and who gets run off. And I know you let him do it. Doyle stepped closer to the bars. You think it's that simple? You think I can just ride out there and arrest the richest man in 3 territories because some drifter says so? I think you took an oath. Oaths don't pay bills, Doyle snapped. They don't feed families or keep roofs over heads. You want to talk about right and wrong? Fine. But out here, survival comes first. Always has. Caleb met his gaze. Then you're not a lawman. You're just another one of Greer's hired guns. Doyle's hand moved to the cell door, and for a moment Caleb thought he might unlock it, might step inside and settle this the old-fashioned way. But instead, Doyle turned and walked toward the exit. You'll stand trial in 3 days, he said without looking back. Judge Carver rides circuit. He'll decide what happens to you. Judge Carver, Caleb said. Let me guess, Greer owns him too. Doyle paused in the doorway. 3 days, Vance. Use them to make peace with whatever comes next. The door slammed shut, leaving Caleb alone in the silence. He sank back onto the bench and closed his eyes. 3 days. It might as well have been 3 lifetimes. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He lay on the bench, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Ember Flats settling into darkness. Somewhere distant, a dog barked. A wagon rattled past on the street outside. Voices drifted through the air, muffled and indistinct. And then, closer, footsteps. Caleb sat up. The footsteps stopped outside his cell. A figure emerged from the shadows, small and slight, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm night. A woman. She stood just beyond the bars, her face obscured by the dim light. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Mr. Vance? Caleb rose and approached the bars. Who are you? She stepped forward, and the faint glow from the window illuminated her features. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. "My name is Sarah Reed," she said. "Thomas was my husband." Caleb's breath caught. Sarah looked at him without flinching, without tears, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of her shawl. "I heard what you did at the saloon," she continued, "what you tried to do." "I failed," Caleb said quietly. "You tried. That's more than anyone else has done." She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why did you stand up for us? You didn't know Thomas. You don't owe us anything." Caleb looked away. "I knew men like Greer. I knew what they do to people who can't fight back." "And you thought you could stop them?" "I thought I could try." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her shawl and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it through the bars. Caleb took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a deed, official, stamped, signed by the land office in Silver Creek. It bore Thomas Reed's name and described a plot of land just outside Ember Flats, 20 acres of open prairie purchased for cash. "This is what Thomas died for," Sarah said. "This piece of paper, this promise of something better." Caleb stared at the deed, his throat tight. "Greer says it doesn't matter," Sarah continued. "He says the land is his, no matter what the paper says. And Marshal Doyle won't do anything to stop him." "So what do you want from me?" Caleb asked. Sarah's eyes burned with something fierce and unbreakable. "I want you to survive. I want you to get out of this cell and finish what Thomas started. I can't do that from in here." "Then I'll get you out." Caleb frowned. "How?" Sarah glanced toward the door, then back at him. "There's a man in town, a lawyer named Silas Boone. He's old, half-blind, and drinks too much, but he knows the law better than anyone within 200 miles. If anyone can get you out of this, it's him." "And you think he'll help?" "He owes Thomas a debt. Years ago, Thomas helped him when no one else would. He'll remember that." Caleb folded the deed and handed it back to her. "Even if he gets me out, Greer won't stop. He'll come for you and the others." "I know," Sarah said, "but we're not leaving. This is our land. We paid for it. We're staying." "You'll die." "Maybe." She tucked the deed back into her shawl. "But we'll die on our own land. That's worth something." She turned to leave, but Caleb spoke again. "Sarah." She stopped. "Your husband," Caleb said slowly. "He believed in something I gave up on a long time ago. He believed people could be better, that the world could be better." Sarah looked back at him, her expression soft. "Do you still believe that?" Caleb hesitated. "I don't know." "Then maybe it's time to find out." She disappeared into the darkness, leaving Caleb alone with the weight of her words. The next morning, a man arrived at the jail. Caleb heard him before he saw him, a cough, like gravel scraping against stone, followed by the shuffle of unsteady footsteps. The door to the marshal's office opened and closed, and voices murmured in low conversation. A few minutes later, Marshal Doyle appeared with the man in tow. Silas Boone looked exactly as Sarah had described. Old, rail-thin, with spectacles perched crookedly on his nose and a suit that had seen better decades. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "This is your lawyer," Doyle said, unlocking the cell door. "You've got 10 minutes." Silas shuffled inside, and Doyle locked the door behind him before retreating to the front office. For a long moment, Silas just stood there, squinting at Caleb through his spectacles. "Well," he said finally, his voice reedy and thin, "you don't look like a killer." "I'm not." "That's what they all say." Silas lowered himself onto the bench with a groan. "Sarah Reed asked me to help you, said you stood up for her husband. I tried. Trying counts for something, I suppose." Silas opened his satchel and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them across his lap. "I've reviewed the charges. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, disturbing the peace. Greer's men are claiming you opened fire without provocation." "That's a lie." "Of course it is. But lies told by rich men carry more weight than truths told by drifters." Silas peered at the papers, then at Caleb. "Judge Carver will be here in 2 days. He's a fair man, but he's also practical. If Greer wants you convicted, you'll be convicted." "Then what's the point of a trial?" "The point," Silas said, adjusting his spectacles, "is to make sure the truth gets heard. Even if it doesn't change the outcome, someone needs to say it out loud. Caleb leaned against the wall. You really think that matters? I think it's all we've got. Silas gathered his papers and stuffed them back into his satchel. I'll do what I can, Mr. Vance, but you need to understand, the odds aren't in your favor. Story of my life. Silas stood and knocked on the cell door. Marshal, I'm finished here. Doyle appeared and unlocked the door. As Silas shuffled out, he glanced back at Caleb. One more thing, Silas said. Sarah asked me to tell you something. She said to remember that faith isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about choosing to act anyway. Before Caleb could respond, Silas was gone. Mutt. The trial took place in the saloon. There was no courthouse in Ember Flats, so Judge Carver sat up at a long table near the bar, his gavel resting beside a glass of water. He was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and a face that gave nothing away. The room was packed. Settlers filled one side, their faces grim and watchful. Townspeople filled the other, whispering among themselves. And at the front, seated like royalty, was Elias Greer. Caleb stood in shackles, flanked by Marshal Doyle and a deputy. Silas Boone sat at a smaller table nearby, shuffling through his papers with trembling hands. Judge Carver banged his gavel once. This court is now in session. We'll keep this simple. Marshal Doyle, present your case. Doyle stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, on the night of the 14th, the defendant, Caleb Vance, entered this establishment and opened fire on 2 men without provocation. 1 man is dead. The other is injured. Multiple witnesses can confirm. Defense? The judge asked, turning to Silas. Silas rose unsteadily. Your Honor, my client acted in self-defense. The men he shot were drawing their weapons first. Can you prove that? I have testimony from Objection, a voice interrupted. Caleb turned. A well-dressed man stood near Greer's table. Greer's personal lawyer, no doubt, sleek and polished like a snake in a tailored suit. The defense has no credible witnesses, the lawyer continued. Only the testimony of squatters and drifters with no standing in this community. Judge Carver frowned. Is that true, Mr. Boone? Silas hesitated. Your Honor, these people have legal deeds to their land. They are citizens with every right to deeds purchased under false pretenses. Greer's lawyer cut in smoothly. The land in question was never legally available for sale. The transactions were fraudulent. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah Reed stood suddenly. That's a lie. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Sit down, ma'am, or I'll have you removed. Sarah remained standing, her voice shaking but defiant. We paid for that land. We have the deeds. They're legal and binding. Not according to the Territorial Land Office, Greer's lawyer said, pulling out a document of his own. I have a letter here from the registrar stating that the land in question was never authorized for public sale. Silas snatched the letter and read it quickly, his face paling. This is dated yesterday. Is it authentic? The judge asked. It bears the registrar's seal, Greer's lawyer said. That makes it authentic. Caleb's jaw tightened. The fix was in. Greer had bought the registrar, rewritten history with a stroke of a pen, and now the settlers' deeds were worthless. Silas looked at Caleb, helpless. Judge Carver banged his gavel again. In light of this evidence, I'm inclined to rule that the settlers have no legal claim to the land, which means Mr. Vance's actions were not in defense of lawful citizens, but in defense of trespassers. Your Honor, Silas began, I've heard enough. The judge turned to Caleb. Mr. Vance, you are found guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. Sentencing will be— Wait! Everyone turned. Caleb stepped forward, his shackles clinking. I have something to say. The judge raised an eyebrow. You'll have your chance to speak at sentencing. I'm speaking now. Marshal Doyle grabbed Caleb's arm, but the judge held up a hand. Let him talk. Caleb looked around the room, at the settlers, at the townspeople, at Greer sitting smug and untouchable. I've lived a lot of years on this frontier, Caleb said slowly. I've seen a lot of things. I've seen men kill for land, for gold, for pride. I've seen families torn apart and communities burned to the ground. And I've seen men like Elias Greer take everything they want because no one has the courage to stop them. Greer's smile didn't waver. But I've also seen something else, Caleb continued. I've seen people like Thomas Reed, people who believe that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs them everything. People who stand up when it's easier to walk away. He paused, his voice growing harder. Thomas Reed is dead because he believed in the law. He believed that a piece of paper with a seal and a signature meant something. And maybe he was wrong. Maybe out here, the law is just whatever men with money say it is. Judge Carver's expression darkened. Mr. Vance, you're dangerously close to contempt. I'm already guilty, Caleb said. What's a little contempt on top of that? A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Caleb turned to face Greer directly. You think you've won. You think you can buy judges and marshals and registrars, rewrite deeds, and erase people whenever they get in your way. And maybe you're right. Maybe you can. Greer leaned back in his chair, amused. Is there a point to this speech, Vance? Yeah, Caleb said. There is. You can buy a lot of things, Greer. But you can't buy what Thomas Reed had. You can't buy the kind of courage it takes to stand unarmed against men with guns. You can't buy the kind of hope that makes people build homes on land they know might kill them. And you sure as hell can't buy the kind of legacy that makes a man's widow stand up in a room full of enemies and call you a liar to your face. Sarah Reed's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Greer's smile finally faded. So go ahead, Caleb said. Hang me. Throw me in prison. It doesn't matter. Because as long as there are people like Sarah Reed and Thomas Reed in this world, you'll never really win. You'll just be a rich man sitting alone in a big house, surrounded by people who only smile because you pay them to. The room was dead silent. Judge Carver cleared his throat. Are you finished? Yeah, Caleb said. I'm finished. The judge banged his gavel. Sentencing is postponed until tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned. As the crowd began to disperse, Marshal Doyle grabbed Caleb and led him back toward the jail. But as they passed Sarah Reed, Caleb caught her eye. She nodded once, a silent thank you. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, the jail was quiet again. Caleb lay on the bench, staring at the ceiling, replaying the trial in his mind. He'd said what he needed to say. Whether it mattered or not, he didn't know, but at least he'd said it. Footsteps echoed outside, heavy, deliberate. Caleb sat up as the door to the jail opened. Marshal Doyle stepped inside alone. He walked to the cell and stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You got a death wish, Vance? He asked finally. Not particularly. Then why'd you do it? Why'd you stand up there and call out Greer in front of half the town? Caleb shrugged. Someone had to? Doyle shook his head. You're a damn fool. Probably. Doyle pulled a key from his belt and unlocked the cell door. Caleb frowned. What are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago. Doyle swung the door open. Get out. Caleb didn't move. Why? Because Sarah Reed reminded me of something tonight, Doyle said quietly. She reminded me that I used to be a lawman, a real one. And real lawmen don't let innocent people hang because rich men say so. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. Caleb stood slowly, his heart pounding. Greer will come after you. Let him. Doyle met his gaze. I'm tired of being scared. Caleb walked to the door, then paused. Thank you. Doyle nodded. There's a horse tied out back. Take it and ride north. Don't stop until you're clear of Greer's territory. What about the settlers? Doyle's jaw tightened. I'll do what I can, but you need to go. Now. Caleb hesitated, torn. Every instinct told him to run, to take the horse, disappear into the night, and never look back. But Sarah Reed's words echoed in his mind. Faith isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about choosing to act anyway. No, Caleb said. Doyle blinked. What? I'm not running. Caleb turned to face him. If I leave now, Greer wins. The settlers lose their land, and Thomas Reed died for nothing. Thomas Reed is already dead, Doyle said harshly. You can't change that. Maybe not, but I can make sure his death meant something. Doyle stared at him for a long moment, then cursed under his breath. You really are a fool. Yeah, Caleb said, but I'm the kind of fool who finishes what he starts. Doyle sighed and locked the cell door again. Then you better have a plan, because Greer's not going to let you walk out of here alive. Caleb smiled grimly. I'm working on it. The next morning, Judge Carver returned to the saloon. The room was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about Caleb's speech, and people had come from miles around to see what would happen next. Caleb stood in shackles again, flanked by Doyle and the deputy. Silas Boone sat at his table, looking older and more tired than ever. Greer was there too, of course, seated in the front row with his lawyer beside him. Judge Carver banged his gavel. This court is now in session. Mr. Vance, you've been found guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Caleb stepped forward. I do, Your Honor. The judge gestured impatiently. Make it quick. I've been thinking about what happened here, Caleb said. About Thomas Reed and the settlers and why Greer wants them gone so badly. And I realized something. He turned to face the crowd. It's not about the land, not really. It's about control. Greer doesn't want people like Thomas Reed here because they remind everyone else that there's another way to live, a way that doesn't involve bowing to him. Greer's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Sit down, the judge said sharply. To Caleb, continue. Thank you, Your Honor. Caleb looked at Greer. You've built an empire here, Greer. You own the land, the businesses, the people. But there's one thing you don't own, and that's the truth. Greer's eyes narrowed. The truth, Caleb continued, is that those settlers bought their land legally. The truth is that you had Thomas Reed killed because he wouldn't back down. And the truth is that every person in this room knows it. They're just too scared to say it out loud. The room erupted in whispers. Judge Carver banged his gavel. Order! Caleb kept talking. So go ahead, Your Honor. Sentence me. Hang me if you want. But when you do, you'll be proving my point. You'll be showing everyone here that the law doesn't protect the innocent. It protects the powerful. The judge's face flushed red. Mr. Vance, you are dangerously— Your Honor, a voice interrupted. Everyone turned. Sarah Reed stood at the back of the room, holding a bundle of papers high above her head. I have evidence, she said loudly. Judge Carver frowned. Evidence of what? Sarah walked forward, her steps steady and sure. She stopped in front of the judge's table and laid the papers down. These are the original deeds, she said, signed and sealed by the Territorial Land Office in Silver Creek. And this, she pulled out another document, is a letter from the registrar confirming their authenticity, dated 2 weeks ago, before Greer's lawyer claims they were invalidated. Greer's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is— Quiet, the judge snapped. He picked up the documents and read them carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. Finally, he looked up at Greer's lawyer. These appear to be legitimate. They can't be, the lawyer stammered. The registrar, Sarah said coldly, was paid by Mr. Greer to forge a second letter invalidating our deeds. But I have proof of the payment, bank records showing a transfer from Greer's account to the registrar's. Made the same day the fraudulent letter was issued. The crowd gasped. Greer shot to his feet. This is absurd. You can't prove— I can, Sarah said. She pulled out one final document, a bank statement with Greer's name at the top. And I will. Judge Carver studied the statement, his jaw tight. Then he looked at Greer. Mr. Greer, he said slowly, do you have an explanation for this? Greer's face was white. That's private financial information. She had no right. She had every right, the judge said. If these documents are authentic, you've committed fraud, and possibly accessory to murder. The room exploded in noise, shouts, accusations, chaos. Caleb stood frozen, watching as everything unraveled. Sarah Reed met his eyes across the room, and she smiled. Judge Carver's gavel came down like a gunshot, cutting through the chaos. Order! He bellowed, his voice echoing off the saloon walls. I will have order in this court. The crowd quieted, but the tension remained, thick and electric, like the air before a storm. All eyes were on Greer, who stood frozen near the front, his face cycling through shock, rage, and calculation. The judge laid the bank statement flat on the table, studying it with the careful attention of a man who knew his next words would define him. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. Mr. Greer, he said slowly, these documents suggest you attempted to defraud these settlers out of legally purchased land. They also suggest you may have been involved in the death of Thomas Reed. Greer's lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, bank records alone don't prove... They prove enough to warrant an investigation, the judge cut in. Marshal Doyle, take Mr. Greer into custody. The room erupted again. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people stood. Greer's face went from white to crimson. You can't be serious, Greer snarled. Do you have any idea who I am, what I've built here? I know exactly who you are, Judge Carver said, his voice like iron. And that's why you're being arrested. Marshal? Doyle hesitated, his hand hovering near his gun. For a moment, Caleb thought he might refuse, that years of fear and compromise would win out over the brief flicker of courage he'd shown the night before. But then Doyle stepped forward, his jaw set. Elias Greer, you're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Greer laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think you can touch me, Doyle? You think a piece of paper and a judge's gavel are going to protect you from what's coming? Maybe not, Doyle said quietly, but I'm willing to find out. He reached for Greer's arm, but Greer jerked away. Don't put your hands on me. Then come quietly. Greer's eyes swept the room, landing on the men scattered throughout the crowd. His men, the hired guns and enforcers who'd kept Ember Flats under his thumb for years. Caleb saw the silent communication pass between them, the subtle nods and shifts in posture. They were preparing to fight. Your Honor, Caleb said sharply, you should clear the room. Judge Carver frowned. Why? Before Caleb could answer, one of Greer's men drew his gun. The saloon exploded into chaos. People screamed and dove for cover. Tables overturned, glass shattered. Doyle grabbed Greer and threw him to the ground just as the first shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood above the judge's head. Caleb dropped to his knees, his shackled hands useless. The deputy beside him drew his weapon and returned fire, hitting one of Greer's men in the shoulder. The man spun and fell, his gun clattering across the floor. More shots followed, a cacophony of violence that turned the saloon into a war zone. Settlers scrambled for the exits, dragging children behind them. Townspeople pressed against walls, covering their heads. And in the center of it all, Greer struggled to his feet, his face twisted with fury. Kill them, he roared. Kill them all! Doyle tackled him again, wrestling him back down. Stay down, you fool! But Greer fought like a cornered animal, clawing at Doyle's face, spitting curses. One of his men lunged forward to help, but the deputy fired, dropping him instantly. Caleb's mind raced. He needed to get free. Needed to end this before more innocent people died. He twisted his wrists, feeling the iron bite into his skin, searching for any weakness in the shackles. A hand grabbed his shoulder. He turned to find Silas Boone crouched beside him, fumbling with a key. Hold still, the old lawyer wheezed, his hand shaking. Where did you... Doyle gave it to me last night, Silas said, jamming the key into the lock. Said you might need it. The shackles clicked open and fell away. Caleb rubbed his wrists, then grabbed the deputy's spare revolver from his belt. Stay down, Caleb told Silas. He rose and scanned the room. 4 of Greer's men were still standing, spread out across the saloon, using overturned tables and the bar for cover. They were skilled, disciplined, not just thugs, but trained gunmen. Caleb moved low and fast, circling toward the nearest one. The man was focused on Doyle and Greer, his back exposed. Caleb closed the distance, raised the revolver, and brought it down hard on the back of the man's skull. He dropped without a sound. 3 left. A bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, close enough to feel the heat. He dove behind a table as another shot splintered the wood. Across the room, the deputy fired back, keeping the shooters pinned. Caleb glanced toward Doyle. The marshal had Greer on the ground, one knee pressed into his back, but Greer was still fighting, still shouting orders. Get them off me, Greer screamed. I'll pay double, triple. One of his men hesitated, torn between loyalty and greed. That hesitation cost him. The deputy's bullet caught him in the chest, and he crumpled, 2 left. The remaining gunmen exchanged a look, then bolted for the door. They fired blindly behind them as they ran, forcing everyone to duck. Caleb rose and fired twice, hitting one in the leg. The man went down hard, sliding across the floor. The last one made it to the door and disappeared into the street. Caleb started after him, but Doyle shouted, Let him go! We've got enough trouble here! Caleb hesitated, then lowered his gun. Doyle was right. Chasing one man into the street would just lead to more bloodshed. The saloon fell silent except for the groans of wounded men and the sobs of frightened women. Smoke hung in the air, thick and acrid. The floor was littered with broken glass, splintered wood, and spent shells. Judge Carver emerged from behind his overturned table, his face pale but resolute. "Marshal, get those wounded men to the doctor and lock Greer in a cell before he causes any more damage." Doyle hauled Greer to his feet. The land baron's face was bruised, his expensive coat torn, but his eyes still burned with rage. "This isn't over," Greer hissed. "You think you've won, but you've just started a war." "Then we'll finish it," Doyle said, shoving him toward the door. As they left, Sarah Reed stepped out from behind a pillar where she'd taken cover. Her dress was dusty, her hair disheveled, but her eyes were clear and fierce. She walked straight to Caleb. "Thank you." "I didn't do much." "You stayed," she said simply. "That's everything. That's—" Caleb looked around the shattered saloon, at the settlers slowly emerging from hiding, at the blood staining the floorboards. "This is just the beginning. Greer has more men, more resources. He's not going to let this go." "I know," Sarah said, "but we're not backing down either." Judge Carver approached, brushing dust from his robes. "Mrs. Reed, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated Greer's claims more thoroughly before ruling against you." "You were doing your job," Sarah said. "Greer's good at hiding what he doesn't want people to see." "Still, I was wrong, and I intend to make it right." The judge turned to Caleb. "Mr. Vance, the charges against you are dismissed. You're a free man." Caleb nodded slowly. "What about Greer?" "He'll stand trial for fraud and conspiracy. If we can prove he ordered Thomas Reed's death, he'll hang." The judge paused. "But proving it won't be easy. Men like Greer don't leave trails." "Then we find the trail," Caleb said. By nightfall, Ember Flats was a town on the edge of collapse. Word of Greer's arrest had spread like wildfire, and the streets were filled with tension. Some of the townspeople celebrated quietly, relieved to see the tyrant finally brought low. Others whispered nervously, afraid of what would happen next. And on the outskirts of town, Greer's remaining men gathered at his ranch, a sprawling estate that sat like a fortress on a hill, overlooking everything below. Caleb stood on the porch of the boarding house, watching the lights flicker in the distance. He'd counted at least 20 men up there, maybe more. Armed, loyal, and waiting for orders. Doyle appeared beside him, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Depends," Caleb said. "You thinking they're going to hit the settlers' camp tonight? Or the jail? Maybe both." Doyle exhaled smoke. "Greer's locked up, but he still has reach. He'll want to send a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind written in blood." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we need to be ready." "We?" Doyle raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to stay, Vance. You're a free man now. You could ride out of here and never look back." "I could," Caleb admitted, "but I won't." Doyle studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, then we do this together." They spent the next hour preparing. Doyle rounded up every man in town willing to fight. Farmers, shopkeepers, even the blacksmith, a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks. It wasn't much of a force, maybe 15 men total, but it was better than nothing. Caleb rode out to the settlers' camp and found Sarah organizing her own defense. The settlers had formed a perimeter around the wagons, armed with rifles, pitchforks, and grim determination. "We're not leaving," Sarah said when Caleb arrived. "Whatever happens, we're staying on our land." "I know," Caleb said, "but you need to be smart about this. Greer's men are professionals. They'll come hard and fast." "Then we'll be ready." Caleb glanced around the camp. Women were loading rifles. Children were being ushered into the center of the circle, where they'd be safest. Men stood at the edges, eyes scanning the darkness. "You ever been in a fight like this before?" Caleb asked Sarah. She met his gaze. "No, but I've already lost my husband. I'm not losing my home, too." Caleb understood. It wasn't about logic or odds. It was about something deeper, a refusal to surrender, to let fear dictate the terms of their lives. "All right," he said, "we'll make our stand here. Doyle and his men will guard the jail. If Greer's men split their forces, we might have a chance." "And if they don't?" "Then we hold as long as we can." Sarah nodded. Thank you, Mr. Vance, for everything. Caleb tipped his hat and rode back toward town. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the prairie. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. In the distance, thunder rumbled, low and ominous, like the growl of something waking. Caleb took up position near the jail, his revolver loaded and ready. Doyle stood beside him, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the road leading from Greer's ranch. Minutes passed, then an hour. The town held its breath, waiting. And then, just after midnight, they came. Riders appeared on the horizon, a dark mass moving fast, hooves pounding like a drumbeat. Caleb counted 20, maybe 25, all armed, all riding with purpose. Here they come, Doyle muttered. The riders split into two groups. The larger group veered toward the settlers' camp. The smaller group, about 10 men, charged straight toward the jail. Hold steady, Doyle shouted to his men. The riders thundered down the main street, guns drawn. The lead rider fired first, the bullet slamming into the wall beside Caleb's head. He ducked and returned fire, his shot catching the rider in the shoulder. The man jerked but stayed in the saddle. Doyle's men opened up from windows and doorways, their rifles cracking in the night. 2 riders went down immediately. The rest scattered, seeking cover behind buildings and water troughs. Caleb moved low, circling toward the side of the jail. One of Greer's men was trying to flank them, creeping along the alley with a shotgun. Caleb stepped out behind him and pressed his revolver to the man's spine. Drop it! The man froze, then let the shotgun clatter to the ground. Walk, Caleb said, shoving him toward the street. And keep your hands where I can see them. He marched the man out into the open, using him as a shield. Tell your friends to stand down. The gunfire paused. The remaining riders turned, seeing their comrade held at gunpoint. Stand down, the man shouted, his voice shaking. He'll shoot me. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the riders raised his rifle. Caleb shoved his captive aside and fired, hitting the rider in the chest. The man toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The others broke and ran, spurring their horses back toward the ranch. Caleb counted 4 bodies in the street, another 2 wounded and crawling for cover. Doyle emerged from the jail, breathing hard. They'll regroup and come back. Maybe, Caleb said, or maybe they'll head for the settlers' camp instead. Doyle cursed. We need to get out there, now. They mounted up and rode hard, the thunder growing louder overhead. As they crested the ridge overlooking the camp, Caleb's heart sank. The settlers were under siege. Greer's men had surrounded the wagons, firing from all sides. The settlers returned fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Already 2 wagons were burning, flames licking into the sky. Caleb spurred his horse forward, Doyle and the others close behind. They hit Greer's men from the rear, catching them by surprise. Caleb fired 3 times in rapid succession, dropping 2 men and scattering the rest. The battle turned into chaos, gunfire, shouting, horses screaming. Caleb fought through it all, his revolver barking, his mind sharp and focused. He saw Sarah crouched behind a wagon, rifle in hand, her face streaked with soot. She fired, reloaded, fired again, her movements calm and deliberate. One of Greer's men charged toward her, knife drawn. Caleb shot him before he got within 10 feet. Sarah glanced at Caleb, nodded once, then turned and kept firing. The fight raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Slowly, inevitably, Greer's men began to retreat. They'd lost too many, and their leader was locked in a cell. Without Greer's money and promises, their loyalty evaporated. They fled into the darkness, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The settlers emerged from cover, battered and exhausted but alive. The fires were extinguished, the wounded were tended to, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the blood from the earth, a fragile silence settled over the camp. Caleb stood in the center of it all, his clothes soaked, his hands trembling from adrenaline. Doyle walked over, his face grim. It's over, Doyle said. For now, Caleb replied. Sarah approached, her rifle slung over her shoulder. We held them. You did, Caleb said, but this isn't finished. As long as Greer's alive, he'll keep coming. Then we make sure he faces justice, Sarah said. The right way, through the law. Caleb looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the refusal to let vengeance consume her even after everything she'd lost. She was stronger than he'd ever been. All right, he said quietly. We do it your way. So, The next morning, Caleb and Doyle rode to Greer's ranch. The place was eerily quiet. Most of Greer's men had fled during the night, abandoning their posts. The few who remained surrendered without a fight, hands raised, eyes empty. They found the ranch house unlocked, its opulent interior untouched. Greer's office was on the second floor, a sprawling room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Caleb began searching through the drawers, pulling out ledgers, contracts, deeds. Doyle joined him, spreading papers across the desk. "Look at this," Doyle said, holding up a journal. "Payments to the registrar, payments to judges, payments to—" He paused, his face darkening. "Payments to me." Caleb looked at him. Doyle's hand shook as he read the entries. "Every month for the past 3 years. I took his money. I knew what he was doing, and I took his money anyway." "You stopped," Caleb said. "Not soon enough." Doyle threw the journal onto the desk. "How many people died because I was too much of a coward to stand up to him?" "Probably a lot," Caleb said bluntly. "But you can't change the past. You can only do better now." Doyle looked at him, eyes red. "How do you live with it? The guilt?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "You don't. You just keep moving. You do the next right thing, and the next, and hope that eventually it adds up to something worth the pain." Doyle nodded slowly, then picked up the journal again. "This is evidence. Enough to hang Greer 10 times over." "Good," Caleb said. "Let's make sure it gets to the right people." They spent the rest of the day cataloging everything, every bribe, every fraudulent deal, every life Greer had ruined in pursuit of power. By the time they were finished, the sun was setting, and the evidence filled 3 crates. Doyle loaded them onto a wagon. "I'll take these to the territorial governor myself. Make sure Greer doesn't weasel his way out of this." "You trust the governor?" "More than I trust anyone else." Doyle climbed onto the wagon. "What about you? What are you going to do?" Caleb looked back toward Ember Flats, where smoke still rose from the settlers' camp. "I'm going to make sure those people get what they paid for. A home. A future." Doyle smiled faintly. "You've changed, Vance." "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or maybe I'm just remembering who I used to be." Doyle nodded and snapped the reins. The wagon rolled forward, carrying the evidence of Greer's crimes toward justice. Caleb watched him go, then mounted his horse and rode back to the camp. The settlers were rebuilding. Despite everything, the attack, the fires, the fear, they'd started again. Frames were being raised. Tools were being hammered. Children played in the dirt, laughing as if the world hadn't nearly ended the night before. Sarah saw Caleb approaching and walked over, wiping sweat from her brow. "We're staying," she said simply. "I can see that." "Judge Carver confirmed our deeds this morning. The land is ours. Legally. Officially." She smiled, a small, tired smile. "Thomas would have been happy." Caleb looked at the half-built homes, the families working side by side. "He would have been proud." Sarah's smile faded. "What about you? Are you staying?" Caleb glanced toward the horizon, where the road stretched endlessly into the distance. For years, that road had been his home, always moving, always running, never stopping long enough to let the ghosts catch up. But standing here now, watching people build something real, something worth protecting, he felt the weight of that loneliness pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "We could use someone like you," Sarah said. "Someone who knows how to fight, how to protect." "I'm not a protector. I'm just a man with a gun." "You're more than that," Sarah said gently, "and I think you know it." Before Caleb could respond, a shout went up from the edge of camp. He turned to see riders approaching, not Greer's men this time, but settlers. New ones. Families in wagons, looking tired and hopeful, drawn by word that there was land here, and people willing to defend it. Sarah's face lit up. "More are coming. The word is spreading." Caleb watched as the new families were greeted, welcomed, shown where they could settle. It was the beginning of something bigger than any one person, a community built on hope instead of fear. "Maybe I'll stay a while," Caleb said quietly. Sarah smiled. "Good. We'll need help finishing the—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The community center, a place for gatherings." Caleb knew she meant the church, the one that would replace the one that had burned 7 years ago, the one that had taken everything from him. He looked toward the spot where the foundation had already been laid, where settlers were measuring timber and planning the structure. His chest tightened. but he didn't look away. "Yeah," he said, "I can help with that." The days that followed were unlike any Caleb had known in 7 years. He woke each morning to the sound of hammers and saws, the rhythmic music of a community building itself from nothing. He worked alongside the settlers, raising beams, hauling timber, digging foundations. His hands blistered and his back aching in ways that felt almost cleansing. There was something honest about physical labor, something that quieted the voices in his head, at least for a while. The community center took shape slowly. Its frame rose against the sky, white timber gleaming in the sun, identical to the church that had burned all those years ago. Caleb tried not to think about that, tried to focus on the present, on the sound of children laughing nearby, on Sarah calling out instructions, on the way the settlers worked together with a unity born of shared struggle. But the past had claws, and it wouldn't let go easily. One afternoon, as Caleb was nailing planks to the exterior wall, he felt it, that familiar tightening in his chest, the sudden flash of memory so vivid it stole his breath. Fire, screaming, the smell of burning flesh. His hands froze mid-swing. "Mr. Vance?" He blinked and turned. A young boy stood nearby, maybe 8 years old, holding a bucket of nails. His name was Daniel, one of Sarah's nephews who'd arrived with the new wave of settlers. "You all right?" Daniel asked, his face scrunched with concern. Caleb forced his hands to unclench. "Yeah, just thinking. My aunt says you think too much." Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. "Your aunt's probably right." Daniel set the bucket down and squinted up at the building. "It's going to be real pretty when it's done. My ma says we'll have dances here and meetings and maybe even weddings." "That's so?" "Yep." Daniel kicked at the dirt. "You ever been to a wedding?" Caleb's throat tightened. "Once." "Was it nice?" "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "It was." Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer. He picked up the bucket and wandered off, leaving Caleb alone with his memories. He'd been 23 when he married Elizabeth. It had been a small ceremony in a frontier church much like this one. Simple, honest, full of hope. They'd had 7 good years together. 7 years of laughter and struggle and the kind of quiet joy that comes from building a life with someone who understands you. And then she was gone. Burned away in minutes, along with their daughter and everything they'd built together. Caleb picked up his hammer and went back to work, driving each nail with more force than necessary. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. Sweat soaked through Caleb's shirt as he worked, his muscles burning with the effort. Around him, other settlers labored in similar silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own reasons for being here. A woman named Martha brought water around midday, ladling it from a barrel she'd hauled on a cart. She was in her 50s, weathered and strong, with hands that had seen decades of hard work. "Drink," she commanded, thrusting a cup at Caleb. "Can't have you passing out from the heat." He drank gratefully, the water cool and sweet. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank the creek." Martha moved on to the next worker, her voice carrying across the work site. "Drink up, all of you. Heat like this'll kill a man faster than bullets." Caleb watched her go, noting the way she moved among the settlers with easy familiarity, joking with some, chiding others, making sure everyone stayed hydrated and safe. She reminded him of Elizabeth, not in appearance, but in spirit. That same fierce protectiveness, that same refusal to let anyone suffer if she could prevent it. He returned to work, but his mind wandered to darker places. To the night of the fire, to the choices he'd made and the ones he hadn't. To the 7 years he'd spent running from himself, convinced that nothing he did mattered because everything that had mattered was already gone. "You're going to break that board if you keep hitting it like that." Caleb looked up to find an older man standing beside him, gray-haired and lean, with the kind of face that had seen too much but somehow kept smiling anyway. His name was Jacob, not the young rider who'd brought news of Greer's death, but an older settler who'd been a carpenter before coming west. "I'm doing it right," Caleb said. "You're doing it angry," Jacob corrected. He gestured to the board, which was indeed showing signs of stress from Caleb's overzealous hammering. "Wood's got grain, same as people. You work with it, not against it." Caleb set down his hammer. "You teaching me carpentry or philosophy?" "Both, if you're willing to learn." Jacob pulled out his own hammer and demonstrated the proper technique, firm but controlled, working with the natural lines of the wood rather than forcing it. See? Let the tool do the work. You're just guiding it. Caleb tried it Jacob's way, and the nail sank smoothly into place without splitting the wood. Better, Jacob said approvingly. You got the hands for this kind of work. Just need to get your head right. My head's fine. Your head's somewhere between here and 7 years ago, Jacob said bluntly. I've seen that look before. Lost my own family back in Missouri. Cholera took my wife and 2 sons in the same week. Caleb stopped working. I'm sorry. I was too. Spent a year drowning in whiskey and self-pity, convinced the world had ended because my world had ended. Jacob pulled another nail from his pouch. Then one day I woke up and realized I had a choice. I could keep dying with them, or I could honor their memory by living, really living, not just existing. So you came west. So I came west, started over, built things instead of tearing myself apart. Jacob met Caleb's gaze. Point is, the pain doesn't go away. But you can choose what you do with it. You can let it make you bitter and hard, or you can let it make you better. Softer, even, in the ways that matter. Caleb had no response to that. Jacob clapped him on the shoulder and moved on to help another worker, leaving Caleb to contemplate the uncomfortable truth in his words. The afternoon wore on. The building took shape board by board, nail by nail, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in Caleb's chest. The tightness eased, the memories receded, and for brief moments, he found himself simply present in the work, focused on the task at hand rather than the ghosts of his past. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah called for everyone to stop. That's enough for today. Good work, all of you. The settlers set down their tools and stretched, groaning good-naturedly about sore muscles and aching backs. Children who'd been playing nearby rushed to their parents, chattering about their day's adventures. Caleb started to walk away, intending to return to the boarding house in town, but Sarah intercepted him. Stay for dinner, she said. It wasn't quite a request. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. You're part of this community now, whether you want to be or not. She smiled. Besides, Martha made stew, and she always makes too much. You'd be doing us a favor. Caleb found himself nodding. All right, thank you. Dinner was served at long tables set up between the wagons. The stew was simple but hearty, venison and vegetables in a rich broth, served with fresh bread that one of the settlers had baked that morning. Caleb sat near the end of one table, intending to eat quickly and slip away. But people kept drawing him into conversation. Martha wanted to know if he'd ever worked as a carpenter before. Jacob asked about his time as a bounty hunter, genuinely curious about the places Caleb had seen and the men he'd tracked. Daniel peppered him with questions about horses and guns, and whether he'd ever fought outlaws like in the dime novels. Caleb answered as best he could, surprised by how easy it was to talk to these people. They didn't judge him for his past, didn't treat him like a killer or an outsider. They just accepted him, welcomed him, made space for him at their table. It was a strange feeling, uncomfortable and comforting at the same time. As the meal wound down and people began clearing dishes, Sarah stood and raised her cup. I want to say something, she announced, her voice carrying across the gathered families. The conversation quieted. Everyone turned to look at her. 2 months ago, most of us didn't know each other, Sarah began. We came from different places, different lives, but we all came here for the same reason. We wanted something better. A place to call home. A future worth building. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. And we've faced things no one should have to face, Sarah continued, her voice strengthening. We've been threatened, attacked. We lost Thomas, a man who believed in the goodness of people even when the world gave him every reason not to. Her eyes glistened, but her voice didn't waver. But we didn't give up. We stood together. We fought for what was right. And because of that, we're still here. We're building homes, raising families, creating something that will last long after we're gone. She raised her cup higher. So I want to thank every one of you for your courage, for your faith, for refusing to let fear make your decisions. Thomas would be so proud of what we've accomplished. To Thomas, someone shouted. To Thomas, the crowd echoed, raising their cups. Caleb raised his own cup, his throat tight. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, men, women, children, all united in their determination to build something good in a world that so often rewarded only the cruel and the powerful. and he realized something that shook him to his core. He wanted to be part of this, not just as a temporary protector or a hired gun, but as a real member of this community, someone who belonged. The realization terrified him. After dinner, as families began retiring to their wagons and homes, Caleb helped clean up. He carried dishes to the washing station, stacked benches, and banked the fires. It was simple work, but it felt right. Felt like contributing to something larger than himself. Sarah approached as he was finishing. "Thank you for staying." "Thank you for asking." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last embers of the cooking fires die down. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead, a cool breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Sure." "Why did you really come back to Ember Flats? After you brought in that first bounty, you could have gone anywhere, but you came back." Caleb considered the question. He'd asked himself the same thing many times. "I don't know, something pulled me here. Maybe I needed to see if places like this could still exist. If people like Thomas could still exist." And they can. He did. Caleb paused. "That matters more than I thought it would." Sarah smiled softly. "You're a good man, Caleb Vance. I hope you know that." "I'm not." "You are. Not because you're perfect, not because you haven't made mistakes, but because when it mattered, when you had every reason to walk away, you stayed. You fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. That's what good men do." Before Caleb could respond, she squeezed his arm gently and walked away, leaving him alone with the night and his thoughts. He stood there for a long time, watching the settlement sleep. Lanterns flickered out one by one. The sounds of conversation faded. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried briefly before being soothed. A dog barked in the distance. It was the sound of life, of normalcy, of hope. And for the first time in 7 years, Caleb let himself hope too. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Word had come from Silver Creek that the trial was scheduled. Sarah gathered every document, every scrap of evidence that proved the settlers' claim to the land. Silas Boone arrived from Ember Flats, his satchel bulging with legal briefs, ready to assist in the prosecution. But alongside the preparation came tension. Rumors drifted back to the camp. Whispers of Greer's men gathering in nearby towns, of hired guns looking for revenge, of plots to break Greer out of jail before the trial could begin. Caleb took the rumors seriously. He couldn't afford not to. He organized watches, rotating settlers through shifts so that someone was always alert, always watching the approaches to the camp. He taught them how to maintain a perimeter, where to position themselves if an attack came, how to maximize their limited firearms. Most of the settlers had never fired a gun in anger. They were farmers, merchants, families seeking peace. But they learned quickly, driven by the knowledge that their lives, their children's lives, might depend on it. One evening, Caleb was conducting target practice with a group of men when Jacob approached, rifle in hand. "Mind if I join?" his old carpenter asked. "You know how to shoot?" "Son, I fought in the war. I know my way around a rifle." Jacob took a position at the line and raised his weapon. His first shot hit the target dead center. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Which war?" "The one that nearly tore this country apart. I was at Gettysburg, Antietam, Cold Harbor." Jacob's face darkened at the memories. "Saw enough killing to last 10 lifetimes. Came west to get away from it." "Looks like it followed you." "It follows all of us eventually. The trick is knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Jacob reloaded and fired again, another perfect shot. This is worth fighting for." Other men lined up, practicing their aim, learning to load and fire quickly. They weren't soldiers, but they were determined. And determination, Caleb had learned, could make up for a lot of inexperience. As the practice session ended and men drifted back to their families, Caleb found himself alone with his thoughts again. He checked his own weapons. The revolver he'd carried for years, cleaned and oiled until it gleamed. The rifle he'd acquired in his bounty hunting days, reliable and accurate. The knife in his boot, a last resort he hoped never to use. Tools of violence, all of them. But sometimes violence was the only language tyrants understood. Sarah appeared, carrying a lantern. "You're brooding again." "I'm preparing. You can do both." She set the lantern down and sat beside him on a log. "Do you think they'll come? Greer's men?" Maybe. Probably. Men like Greer don't go down easy. Even locked in a cell, he's still dangerous. Then we'll be ready. Caleb looked at her. At this woman who'd lost her husband, who had every reason to flee, to give up, to let fear dictate her choices. But instead she sat here, calm and resolute, ready to face whatever came. You're braver than I ever was, he said quietly. I'm not brave, I'm just stubborn. There's a difference. Sarah smiled. Besides, I have something you didn't have when you lost your family. What's that? I have all of you. I'm not alone in this. That makes it easier. Caleb realized she was right. When Elizabeth and his daughter died, he'd been alone with his grief. No community to support him, no one to share the burden, just him and the ashes and a rage that consumed everything. But Sarah had this settlement. These people. They carried each other's pain, shared each other's strength. Maybe that was the difference between surviving and truly living. We should get some sleep, Sarah said, standing. Big day tomorrow. We leave for Silver Creek at dawn. I'll take last watch, Caleb said. Make sure everything's quiet before we go. Sarah nodded and left him to his vigil. The night was peaceful. No threats emerged from the darkness. No riders appeared on the horizon. Just the steady sounds of a settlement at rest. Snoring, the crackle of dying fires, the occasional cry of a nightbird. But Caleb remained alert, watching, waiting, because he knew from experience that peace was fragile, that it could shatter in an instant, leaving only blood and screaming in its wake. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not here. Not to these people. As dawn broke pink and gold across the prairie, Sarah emerged from her wagon dressed in simple black, mourning clothes, dignified and stark. Other settlers gathered to see them off, offering words of encouragement and prayer. Caleb saddled his horse and checked his weapons one last time. They'd be traveling with Silas in his wagon, plus 4 settlers serving as guards. It wasn't much of an escort, but it would have to be enough. The journey to Silver Creek would take 3 days. 3 days exposed on the open road, vulnerable to ambush or attack. 3 days to reach justice, or die trying. As they prepared to leave, Daniel ran up to Caleb, breathless. "Mr. Vance, wait!" Caleb turned. "What is it?" The boy thrust something into his hand. A small wooden carving of a horse, crude but recognizable. "I made this for you, for good luck." Caleb stared at the carving, touched despite himself. "Daniel, I can't. Please. My pa says you're going to keep Mrs. Reed safe, so you need all the luck you can get." Daniel's eyes were wide and serious. "Bring her back, okay?" Caleb knelt down to the boy's level. "I will. I promise." Daniel threw his arms around Caleb's neck in a quick, fierce hug, then ran off before Caleb could respond. Caleb stood slowly, tucking the carving into his pocket. Sarah watched with knowing eyes. "He's gotten attached to you," she said. "Yeah, I noticed." "Is that a problem?" Caleb thought about that. About what it meant to let people close, to care about them, to make promises he might not be able to keep, about how much it hurt when you lost them. "No," he said finally. "It's not a problem." They mounted up and rode out, leaving the settlement behind. The settlers lined the road, waving farewell, their faces full of hope and worry. Caleb looked back once, seeing the white frame of the church rising against the morning sky, seeing the homes and families they'd fought so hard to protect. Then he turned forward and focused on the road ahead. The first day passed without incident. They traveled east through rolling prairie, following the main road toward Silver Creek. The weather was good, clear skies, moderate temperature, a light breeze that kept the heat bearable. They made good time, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a quick meal. Caleb rode ahead of the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The 4 settler guards flanked them, 2 on each side, rifles ready, alert but inexperienced. Silas rode in the wagon beside Sarah, his nose buried in legal documents, muttering to himself about precedents and arguments. As evening approached, they made camp near a small creek. The guards set up a perimeter while Caleb tended the horses, and Sarah prepared a simple dinner over the fire. "You're quiet today," Sarah observed as they ate. "Just thinking." "About the trial?" "About everything." Caleb poked at his food. "About what happens after. Assuming we win." "When we win," Sarah corrected. "Not assuming. When." "All right. When we win. What then?" "Greer's empire collapses, his men scatter, The settlers keep their land. But there will be others. Men like Greer always have successors. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with them when they come. We build something strong enough to withstand whatever comes next. That's all we can do. Is it enough? It has to be. One of the guards called out softly. Rider approaching. From the north. Caleb was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver. The others tensed, weapons ready. A single horseman emerged from the twilight, moving at an easy pace, not charging, not threatening, just riding. As he drew closer, Caleb recognized him. Marshal Doyle. Caleb relaxed slightly, but didn't holster his weapon. Doyle? What are you doing out here? The marshal dismounted, looking travel-worn. Came to escort you the rest of the way. Had a feeling you might need backup. We've got guards. You've got farmers with rifles. No offense to them, but if Greer's men come, you'll need someone who knows how to fight. Doyle gestured to his horse. So, I'm coming with you. Judge Halloway approved it. Sarah stepped forward. Thank you, Marshal. We appreciate it. Doyle tipped his hat. Just doing my job, ma'am. He joined them at the fire, accepting a plate of food and filling them in on news from Silver Creek. The trial was still scheduled. Greer remained in custody, though his lawyers were fighting tooth and nail for delays and dismissals. The town was buzzing with anticipation. Apparently it was the biggest legal proceeding in territorial history. Greer's putting on quite a show, Doyle said, acting like a wounded innocent, claiming he's being persecuted by jealous rivals. His lawyers are good, real good. But we have the evidence, Silas interjected. The deeds, the bank records, the testimony, evidence can be explained away if you've got the right lawyer, Doyle interrupted. And Greer's got 3 of them. They'll twist everything, make you look like liars and opportunists. It won't be easy. Sarah's jaw set. We didn't come this far to give up now. No, ma'am, I don't expect you did. They finished eating and set watches for the night. Caleb took first shift, walking the perimeter of their small camp, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and mysterious under the stars. Somewhere out there, Greer's men might be plotting, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. Or maybe they'd already given up. Maybe with their leader locked away, they'd scattered to find other employers, other causes. Caleb didn't know which scenario worried him more. His watch passed quietly. Doyle relieved him at midnight, and Caleb lay down near the fire, his rifle within reach. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams he'd rather forget. Fire. Screaming. Elizabeth's face as the flames consumed her. He woke with a start just before dawn, his heart racing, sweat cold on his skin. The camp was still quiet. The fire had burned to embers. Doyle sat nearby, keeping watch, his silhouette dark against the lightening sky. Caleb sat up and rubbed his face, willing the images away. Bad dreams? Doyle asked quietly. The usual. They ever get better? Not yet. Doyle was silent for a moment. I dream about the people I didn't save, the ones I could have helped if I'd had more courage. It's a long list. Mine too. But we're trying now. That has to count for something. Does it? I don't know, Doyle admitted, but I'm going to keep believing it does. Because if it doesn't, what's the point of any of this? Caleb had no answer for that. They broke camp at first light and continued east. The second day passed much like the first, steady travel, watchful vigilance, no signs of trouble. They made camp that night in a grove of cottonwood trees, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze like whispered conversations. Sarah sat with Silas, reviewing testimony, preparing for the questions she'd face on the stand. Caleb watched her from across the fire, noting the determination in her face, the way she held herself with quiet strength. She caught him looking and smiled. Something on your mind? Just thinking you're going to do fine tomorrow. Tomorrow's still a day away. We won't reach Silver Creek until late on the 3rd day. You'll still do fine. Her smile widened. Thank you for the vote of confidence. That night, Caleb's watch was interrupted by sounds from the darkness. Rustling, movement, the snap of a twig. He rose silently, revolver drawn, and moved toward the noise. A deer burst from the undergrowth, startled by his approach, and bounded away into the night. Just a deer. Caleb released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and returned to camp, but sleep eluded him for the rest of the night. He lay awake, staring at the stars, thinking about tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would follow, thinking about whether a man could ever truly outrun his past, or whether it just followed behind, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when he stopped running. They reached Silver Creek late on the third day, just as Caleb had predicted. The town rose from the prairie like a promise. Brick buildings, paved streets, gas lamps beginning to glow as dusk settled in. It was bigger than Ember Flats, more established, with the air of a place that had already decided what it wanted to be. The courthouse dominated the central square, its white columns gleaming in the fading light. People moved along the sidewalks, going about their business, glancing curiously at the newcomers. Doyle led them to the marshal's office, where they could stable their horses and secure their belongings. Then he showed Sarah and Silas to a boarding house where rooms had been reserved. "Get some rest," Doyle advised. "Trial starts at 9 tomorrow morning. You'll want to be sharp." Sarah nodded, looking suddenly exhausted. The strain of the journey, the weight of what lay ahead, it was all catching up with her. Caleb walked her to her room. "You need anything? I'll be right downstairs." "I know, thank you." She paused at her door. "Caleb, what if we lose?" "We won't." "But what if we do? What if Greer's lawyers are too good? What if the judge sides with him? What if—" "Sarah?" Caleb put his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "We didn't come this far to lose. You have the truth on your side. You have the evidence. You have people who believe in you. That's more than Greer ever had." She searched his face, then nodded. "You're right. I'm just scared." "Being scared is fine. Being scared means you're human. But don't let it paralyze you. Tomorrow you walk into that courtroom and you tell your truth. You tell Thomas's truth. And you let the chips fall where they may." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Okay, I can do that." "I know you can." She hugged him suddenly, a quick, fierce embrace that caught him off guard. Then she disappeared into her room, leaving Caleb standing in the hallway. He made his way downstairs and found a chair in the boarding house lobby, settling in for a night of watchfulness. Doyle joined him an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep either?" the marshal asked. "Never could the night before something big." They sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee, watching the street outside grow quiet as Silver Creek settled into sleep. "You ever wonder what you'd be doing if none of this had happened?" Doyle asked eventually. "If Greer had never existed, if Thomas Reed had never died, if you'd just kept drifting." Caleb considered that. Probably sitting in some other town, drinking alone, wondering why nothing felt like it mattered anymore. And now? Now things matter again. "I'm not sure if that's better or worse." Doyle chuckled. "I know what you mean. Caring hurts. But not caring. That's a different kind of pain. A slower death." "Yeah." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. As midnight approached and the town clock chimed the hour, Caleb stood and stretched. "I'm going to walk the perimeter. Make sure everything's secure. Want company?" "No. Get some rest. One of us should be sharp tomorrow." Doyle nodded and headed upstairs. Caleb stepped outside into the cool night air. Silver Creek was quiet, peaceful. Street lamps cast pools of golden light at intervals along the sidewalk. Somewhere distant, a piano played, probably from one of the saloons. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Caleb walked slowly, checking alleys, noting exits and approaches. Old habits from his bounty hunting days, never quite forgotten. As he passed the courthouse, he paused to look up at it. Tomorrow, inside those walls, the fate of the settlement would be decided. Sarah would testify. Greer would defend himself. And a judge and jury would determine who was telling the truth. It should have been simple. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses credible. Justice should be certain. But Caleb had lived long enough to know that justice and certainty rarely occupied the same space. He completed his circuit and returned to the boarding house, finally allowing himself a few hours of fitful sleep in the lobby chair. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Caleb was already awake and preparing for the day ahead. The trial was about to begin. And with it, the final test of whether the frontier could still be a place where right mattered more than might. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Spectators filled every bench, crammed shoulder to shoulder, settlers who'd made the journey from Reed's Landing, townspeople from Silver Creek curious about the spectacle, journalists who'd traveled from as far as Denver and Kansas City to cover what the newspapers were calling the trial of the decade. The air buzzed with anticipation, thick with the scent of too many bodies in too small a space, and the low murmur of speculation rippled through the crowd like water. Caleb sat in the front row beside Sarah, his eyes fixed on the defendant's table where Elias Greer would soon appear. The table stood empty for now, but Greer's 3 lawyers were already there. Sharp-faced men in expensive suits, their briefcases bulging with documents, conferring in whispers that suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. Sarah sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. But Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her fingers. She'd dressed carefully that morning, the same black morning dress, her hair pulled back severely, no jewelry except for her wedding ring. She looked dignified, serious, credible. She looked like a woman who'd lost everything and refused to lose anything more. Silas Boone sat at the prosecution table with the territorial prosecutor, Franklin Pierce. Silas looked even older this morning, his hands shaking as he arranged papers, his spectacles sliding down his nose. But his eyes were sharp, focused. He'd told Caleb over breakfast that this was the most important case he'd ever worked on. Win or lose, Silas had said, this one matters. The bailiff entered through a side door. All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Halloway. The crowd surged to its feet as the judge entered, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. She wore her robes with the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that altered lives. She took her seat, surveyed the courtroom with a gaze that missed nothing, and banged her gavel once. This court is now in session. Be seated. The crowd sat in a rustle of fabric and creaking wood. Judge Halloway opened a folder on her desk. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Elias Greer on charges of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of public officials, and unlawful seizure of property. This is a serious matter, and I will tolerate no disruptions. Anyone who cannot maintain proper courtroom decorum will be removed. Her gaze swept the room, and people shifted uncomfortably under its weight. Bailiff, bring in the defendant. A side door opened, and Elias Greer entered. He looked different from the last time Caleb had seen him. Gone was the disheveled rage, the screaming threats. The mask finally slipped. In its place was careful composure. Greer wore a perfectly tailored suit, his hair combed and pomaded, his face calm and almost sorrowful. He moved like a man wronged, shoulders slightly bowed, eyes downcast with practiced humility. It was a performance, a damned good one. Greer took his seat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyers. He glanced briefly at Sarah, and Caleb saw something flicker in his expression. Contempt, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by that carefully constructed mask of wounded innocence. Judge Halloway addressed the courtroom. The prosecution may make its opening statement. Franklin Pierce rose, a lean man in his 40s with a prosecutor's face, all sharp angles and skeptical eyes. He approached the jury box, where 12 men sat, farmers, merchants, a blacksmith, a schoolteacher, regular people who would decide an extraordinary case. Gentlemen of the jury, Pierce began, his voice clear and carrying. The evidence you will hear over the next few days will paint a picture of systematic corruption, violence, and greed. You will hear how Elias Greer, a man of wealth and influence, used that wealth and influence to terrorize innocent families, to steal land that was not his, and to order the murder of a man whose only crime was believing in the rule of law. He paused, letting the words settle. You will hear testimony from Sarah Reed, widow of Thomas Reed, who watched her husband gunned down in cold blood on Greer's orders. You will see bank records proving that Greer paid bribes to corrupt officials, forged documents to invalidate legal land deeds, and hired assassins to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Pierce turned to look at Greer, who sat unmoved, his expression neutral. The defense will try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Greer is a respectable businessman being persecuted by jealous rivals and opportunistic settlers. But the evidence, the cold, hard facts, will show you the truth. Elias Greer is a criminal, a murderer, a man who believed himself above the law. Pierce's voice rose slightly. And it is your duty, gentlemen, to prove him wrong, to show that no amount of money, no amount of power can purchase immunity from justice. Thank you. He sat down. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing his words. Judge Holloway turned to the defense. Your opening statement. The lead defense attorney stood, a silver-haired man named Clarence Whitmore, with a voice like honey and a reputation for never losing a case. He smiled at the jury, warm and avuncular, as if they were old friends gathering for pleasant conversation. Gentlemen, Whitmore began, my esteemed colleague Mr. Pierce has just told you a story. A compelling story, I'll admit. But that's all it is. A story. And like all stories, it has been carefully crafted to elicit a specific emotional response. He walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each man. But this is a court of law, not a theater. And in a court of law, we deal in facts, not narratives designed to tug at heartstrings. So let me tell you the facts about Elias Greer. Whitmore gestured toward his client. Mr. Greer came to this territory 30 years ago with nothing but determination and vision. He built businesses from scratch. He created jobs. He brought civilization to a wilderness. He is, by any measure, a pillar of this community. Some members of the jury nodded slightly. Whitmore saw it and pressed on. Yes, Mr. Greer is wealthy. Yes, he owns substantial property. But that wealth was earned honestly through hard work and smart business decisions. The prosecution would have you believe that success itself is evidence of criminality, that a man cannot prosper without somehow being corrupt. Whitmore shook his head sadly. That is not the America I know. That is not the frontier spirit that built this territory. He paused for effect. Now, the prosecution will present what they call evidence, but I urge you to examine that evidence critically. Ask yourselves, are these facts or are they interpretations? Are these proofs or are they assumptions made by people with axes to grind against a successful man? Whitmore returned to his table. Mr. Greer is innocent of these charges, and by the time this trial concludes, you will see that clearly. Thank you. He sat down and Caleb felt his jaw tighten. It was masterful. The opening statement hadn't defended Greer so much as it had reframed the entire narrative, made the prosecution look like they were attacking success itself rather than prosecuting crimes. Sarah's hand found Caleb's, her grip tight. He squeezed back, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. The prosecution may call its first witness. Franklin Pierce stood. The prosecution calls Sarah Reed to the stand. Sarah released Caleb's hand and rose. She walked to the witness box with her head high, her steps steady, despite what must have been a storm of emotions inside her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and unwavering. Pierce approached. Mrs. Reed, can you please tell the court about your husband, Thomas? Sarah took a slow breath. Thomas Reed was my husband of 12 years. He was a farmer by trade, a man of principle, and a natural leader. When our family decided to move west and join others seeking a better life, Thomas organized the journey. He handled the negotiations with the land office. He made sure everything was done legally and properly. And did you purchase land outside Ember Flats? Yes, sir. We purchased 20 acres from the Territorial Land Office right here in Silver Creek. We paid $800 in cash. We received properly executed deeds signed and sealed by the Territorial Registrar. Pierce produced the deeds and entered them as evidence, passing copies to the jury. What happened after you settled on that land? Sarah's voice remained steady, but Caleb could hear the pain beneath it. We began building homes, planting crops, creating a community. And then Elias Greer's men came. What did they say? They said the land belonged to Mr. Greer, that our deeds were worthless, that we needed to leave immediately or face consequences. And did you leave? No, sir. We had legal deeds. We had paid fair value. We believed, Thomas believed, that the law would protect us. Pierce walked slowly across the courtroom. What happened next? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They came back 3 days later, a dozen armed men. They rode into our camp firing weapons into the air, scaring the children, threatening us. And when Thomas tried to reason with them, tried to show them our deeds, she paused, swallowing hard. They shot him, right in front of me. in front of our children. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway's gavel came down. Order. Did you see who fired the shot? Pierce asked gently. A man named Frank Dalton. He worked for Mr. Greer. Everyone knew it. And what did you do after your husband was killed? I held him while he died, Sarah said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. And then I buried him. And then I decided that his death would mean something, that we wouldn't let fear drive us from land we'd purchased legally and honestly. Pierce gave her a moment to compose herself. Mrs. Reed, how did you obtain the bank records showing payments from Mr. Greer to various officials? Sarah wiped her eyes. I went to every bank in Silver Creek and Ember Flats. I showed them my husband's death certificate and explained what had happened. One banker, a man named Henry Walsh, took pity on me. He showed me records of large payments from Greer's accounts to the territorial registrar, to local officials, to known gunmen. He provided copies at great personal risk. Objection, Whitmore called out. Hearsay. Mrs. Reed cannot testify to what some banker allegedly told her. Sustained, Judge Holloway said. Strike that last statement. The jury will disregard the reference to what the banker said. Pierce nodded, unperturbed. Mrs. Reed, I show you these bank records marked as Exhibit C. Do you recognize them? Yes, sir. Those are the records Mr. Walsh provided. And what do they show? They show 3 payments totaling $1,500 from Elias Greer's personal account to the territorial registrar, dated 1 week before our deeds were declared invalid. They also show payments to Frank Dalton and other known enforcers. Pierce entered the records as evidence. Thank you, Mrs. Reed. No further questions. He sat down and Whitmore rose like a predator sensing blood. Mrs. Reed, he began, his tone sympathetic but probing, I am deeply sorry for your loss. No one should have to endure what you've endured. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew what was coming. But I must ask you some difficult questions, Whitmore continued. You testified that Frank Dalton shot your husband. Did you actually see Mr. Greer give the order to kill Thomas Reed? No, but a simple yes or no, please. No, I did not see him give that specific order. So you're inferring intent based on the fact that Mr. Dalton worked for Mr. Greer. Mr. Dalton was Greer's enforcer. Everyone knew it. He didn't act independently. Whitmore smiled gently. But you don't actually know that for certain, do you? You didn't hear Mr. Greer order your husband's death? No, Sarah admitted reluctantly. And these bank records you've presented, while they do show payments, is it possible those payments were for legitimate business services? Mr. Greer is a businessman with many expenses and many employees. $1,500 to a registrar isn't a legitimate expense, Sarah shot back. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was payment for consulting services, for expedited processing of documents, for any number of legal purposes. Whitmore shrugged. The point is, you don't know. You're assuming corruption. Sarah's hands clenched. I know what I know. I know my husband was murdered. I know Greer wanted our land. I know the timing of these payments is suspicious. Suspicious, yes. But suspicion isn't proof, Mrs. Reed. Whitmore's voice hardened slightly. Isn't it possible that you're a grieving widow looking for someone to blame? That in your pain you've constructed a conspiracy where simpler explanations exist? Caleb's hand moved toward his revolver before he caught himself. Beside him, Silas muttered under his breath. But Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Whitmore. No, she said firmly. What I've constructed, Mr. Whitmore, is a case based on evidence. Bank records don't lie. Dead husbands don't lie. The only person lying in this courtroom is sitting at that table. She pointed directly at Greer. The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway's gavel came down repeatedly. Order! Order in this court! Whitmore tried to continue, but Sarah cut him off. My husband believed in the law. He believed that doing things the right way mattered, and he died for that belief. So don't you dare suggest that I'm just some hysterical woman inventing conspiracies. I have facts, I have evidence, and I have the truth. Mrs. Reed, Whitmore began. And the truth, Sarah continued, her voice rising, is that Elias Greer is a murderer who hides behind money and lawyers and the pretense of respectability, but I see him for what he is, and I pray this jury does too. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Mrs. Reed, you will limit yourself to answering questions. Mr. Whitmore, do you have further questions for this witness? Whitmore hesitated, clearly recognizing that continuing would only give Sarah more opportunities to speak. No, Your Honor, no further questions. Sarah stepped down from the witness box and returned to her seat. Caleb could see her trembling now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. He touched her shoulder gently. You did good, he whispered. She nodded, unable to speak. The trial continued. Pierce called witness after witness, settlers who'd been threatened, the banker who'd provided the records, even the territorial registrar himself, who broke down on the stand and confessed to taking Greer's bribe in exchange for forging documents. He said it was just business, the registrar sobbed. He said no one would get hurt. I needed the money. My wife was sick. I had debts. And did you forge a letter invalidating the settler's deeds? Pierce asked. Yes. Yes, I did. I'm so sorry. Whitmore cross-examined aggressively, trying to cast doubt on every testimony, suggesting alternative explanations, attacking credibility. But the evidence kept mounting piece by piece, building an undeniable picture of corruption and violence. Marshal Doyle testified about conversations he'd overheard, orders Greer had given, bribes he himself had accepted and now regretted. His testimony was damning, and Whitmore's attempts to discredit him as a corrupt lawman backfired. Doyle's willingness to admit his own failings made him more credible, not less. By the end of the second day, the prosecution rested. Judge Holloway adjourned until morning. The defense will present its case tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Court dismissed. Caleb and Sarah left the courthouse as the sun set, casting long shadows across Silver Creek's main street. Sarah looked exhausted, wrung out from the emotional toll of testimony and cross-examination. How do you think it went? She asked quietly. You were incredible, Caleb said. You told the truth. That's all you can do. But will it be enough? I don't know, but we're not done yet. They returned to the boarding house where Martha had arrived with several other settlers to provide support. She'd brought food, a proper meal, not trail rations, and insisted everyone eat together. You need your strength, Martha declared, ladling stew into bowls. Tomorrow, they'll try to tear down everything you built today. Can't let them do it on an empty stomach. The settlers gathered around the table, sharing the meal and discussing the day's testimony. The mood was cautiously optimistic. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the witnesses credible. But Caleb couldn't shake his unease. Greer hadn't testified yet. Whitmore hadn't presented his defense, and men with money and power had a way of escaping consequences. After dinner, he stepped outside for air. The street was quiet. Most shops closed for the evening. A few people walked past, nodding politely. Somewhere distant, a dog barked. Doyle appeared beside him, lighting a cigarette. You worried? Always. Good. Complacency gets people killed. Doyle exhaled smoke. For what it's worth, I think we're winning. The jury looked convinced. Looked. But looking convinced and voting guilty are different things. True enough. Doyle studied the glowing end of his cigarette. I've been thinking about what happens after, assuming Greer's convicted. What about it? His empire will collapse. All that land, all those holdings, it'll go up for auction. Some of it will go to the settlers, but the rest? Doyle shrugged. Nature abhors a vacuum. Someone will try to fill it. Caleb nodded slowly. You think there will be more trouble? I think there's always more trouble. The question is whether we're ready for it. They stood in silence, two men who'd chosen, late perhaps, but chosen nonetheless, to stand on the side of something worth defending. I'm staying, Caleb said abruptly. After this is over. I'm staying at Reed's Landing. Doyle smiled. Figured you would. You're not the drifting type anymore. No, I guess I'm not. Dub. The next morning, the defense began its case. Whitmore called character witnesses, businessmen who swore Greer was honest and upstanding, a pillar of the community who'd never harm anyone. Each one painted him as a victim of jealous competitors and ungrateful settlers trying to steal what he'd rightfully built. It was theater, carefully orchestrated. But Caleb watched the jury and saw doubt creeping in. The witnesses were respectable men, well-dressed and articulate. They were convincing. Pierce cross-examined each one, highlighting their financial ties to Greer, their motivations for defending him. But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted. Then Whitmore called Greer himself to the stand. Greer took the oath with his hand on the Bible, his expression solemn and sincere. He sat in the witness box like a man wronged, shoulders slightly bowed, voice quiet and pained. "Mr. Greer," Whitmore began, "did you order the murder of Thomas Reed?" "No, absolutely not." Greer's voice cracked with emotion. "I never ordered anyone's death. The very suggestion is abhorrent to me." "Did you bribe the territorial registrar to forge documents?" "No, sir. I made a payment to the registrar's office for expedited processing of some land transfers. It was a standard administrative fee, nothing more." "And the payments to Frank Dalton and other men accused of violence?" "I employ security personnel," Greer said. "The frontier is dangerous. Men like Dalton provided protection for my properties and employees. If they committed crimes on their own initiative, I had no knowledge of it." Whitmore nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Greer, why do you think these settlers are making these accusations against you?" Greer sighed heavily. "I believe they're mistaken, perhaps even deliberately misleading the court. I own substantial land in that region, land I purchased legally, years before they arrived. When they tried to settle on property that belonged to me, I attempted to resolve the situation peacefully, but they refused to acknowledge my prior claim." "So you believe they're trying to steal your land?" "I believe they were misinformed about what land was available for purchase. And rather than admit their mistake, they've constructed this elaborate conspiracy theory to make me the villain." It was a masterful performance. Greer looked directly at the jury as he spoke, his voice earnest, his manner humble. He portrayed himself as a hard-working man being persecuted by opportunistic settlers and overzealous prosecutors. Pierce's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Greer, you testified that you own the land the settlers tried to occupy. Can you produce deeds proving that ownership?" Greer hesitated. "The deeds were lost in a fire several years ago." "How convenient. So we only have your word that you owned that land before the settlers purchased it." "I've owned property in that region for nearly 3 decades. Everyone knows isn't evidence, Mr. Greer. Do you have any documentation proving prior ownership?" "Not with me, no." Pierce produced a document. "I show you a survey map from the Territorial Land Office, dated 1868. Does it show the disputed land as belonging to you?" Greer studied it. "No, but maps can be incomplete. So the official territorial survey doesn't support your claim of prior ownership, yet you expect this jury to believe you over documented evidence from the land office?" Whitmore objected. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Holloway said. "Rephrase, Mr. Pierce." Pierce nodded. "Mr. Greer, you claim the $1,500 paid to the registrar was an administrative fee. Isn't it true that standard administrative fees are typically $5 to $10? Larger transactions require more work." "What larger transaction? You just testified you don't have deeds proving ownership. What were you paying the registrar to process?" Greer stumbled. There were multiple properties involved." "Name them, specifically." "I can't recall the exact—" "You can't recall paying $1,500 for processing fees, but you can recall that you definitely owned land the settlers purchased?" Pierce's voice dripped with skepticism. "Which is it, Mr. Greer? Is your memory reliable or not?" The cross-examination continued for hours. Pierce hammered at every inconsistency, every convenient memory lapse, every implausible explanation. By the time he finished, Greer looked shaken, his carefully constructed facade showing cracks. But Whitmore was skilled at rehabilitation. On redirect, he gave Greer opportunities to explain away the inconsistencies, to restore his credibility. It was a legal dance, thrust and parry, each side landing blows but neither delivering a knockout. The defense rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next morning. That night Caleb couldn't sleep. He paced his room in the boarding house, mind racing. The trial could go either way. The evidence was strong, but Greer's lawyers were skilled. The jury might believe Sarah and the witnesses, or they might be swayed by Greer's performance of wounded innocence. There were no certainties, only possibilities. He thought about Thomas Reed, about the man's unwavering faith in justice, about Sarah's courage in standing up to her husband's killer. About all the settlers who'd risked everything for a piece of land and a chance at a better life. They deserved justice, but the world didn't always give people what they deserved. Sometime after midnight, Caleb finally dozed off in the chair by his window. He woke to pounding on his door. "Vance, wake up!" It was Doyle's voice, urgent and alarmed. Caleb grabbed his revolver and threw open the door. The marshal stood in the hallway, his face pale. "It's Greer. He's dead." Caleb's blood went cold. "What?" "They found him in his cell an hour ago. Hanged himself with his own belt. Left a confession." The words didn't make sense. Caleb's mind raced, trying to process. "That's impossible. Greer wouldn't—" "There's more." Doyle thrust a piece of paper at him. "Read it." Caleb unfolded the letter. It was written in neat handwriting, the penmanship precise and careful. "To whom it may concern, I can no longer live with the weight of my crimes. I ordered the death of Thomas Reed. I bribed officials to forge documents invalidating the settlers' land deeds. I used violence and intimidation to build my empire. Everything the prosecution has alleged is true. I am guilty. I cannot face the shame of public execution. I cannot live knowing the harm I've caused to innocent families. May those I've wronged find peace in my death. Elias Greer." Caleb read it twice, his mind spinning. Something was wrong. The tone was too remorseful, too willing to admit fault. Greer had been defiant to the end, screaming threats even as they led him from the courtroom during his arrest. Men like that didn't break, didn't confess, and they certainly didn't take their own lives. "This doesn't feel right," Caleb said slowly. "No," Doyle agreed. "It doesn't, but it's signed. The handwriting matches samples we have from his business documents, and he's dead." "Who found him?" "The night guard. Says he checked on Greer at midnight and everything was fine. Checked again at 2 and he was hanging from the cell bars." "And the guard didn't hear anything? No struggle? No sounds?" Doyle shook his head. "He says Greer was quiet all night." Caleb's jaw tightened. Someone had gotten to Greer. Someone had either forced him to write that confession or forged it themselves. And then they'd staged his death to look like suicide. But who and why? "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "Judge Holloway is reviewing the confession. She'll likely declare the case resolved and dismiss the charges posthumously." Doyle's expression was grim. "Greer's dead, he confessed. Justice is served, technically." "That's not justice, that's murder covered up." "Maybe. Probably. But can we prove it?" Doyle spread his hands helplessly. "The confession exists. Greer's dead. Unless we can prove someone else wrote that letter or killed him, the official story is suicide." Caleb wanted to argue, to demand an investigation, but he knew Doyle was right. Without proof, they had nothing but suspicions. And suspicions didn't change facts. "I need to tell Sarah," Caleb said. "I'll come with you." They found Sarah already awake, dressed and preparing for the final day of the trial. When Doyle explained what had happened, she sank onto the bed, her face draining of color. "Dead?" she whispered. "But the trial, the verdict." "There won't be a verdict," Doyle said gently. "The case is closed. Greer confessed and took his own life. Legally, that ends it." Sarah looked at Caleb. "Do you believe it? That he killed himself?" "No," Caleb said honestly. "But I can't prove otherwise." "So someone murdered him. Someone who wanted to make sure he never testified further, never revealed who else was involved." Sarah's hands clenched. "And they get away with it." "We don't know that," Doyle said. "We don't know who or why or—" "It doesn't matter," Sarah interrupted, her voice hollow. "Greer's dead. The settlers keep their land. Thomas is still gone. That's all that matters in the end, isn't it?" Caleb knelt in front of her. "Sarah, I wanted him to face justice," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted him to stand in front of that jury and hear them say guilty. I wanted him to know that his money and his power couldn't save him. I wanted—" Her voice broke. "I wanted it to mean something." "It does mean something," Caleb said firmly. "Whether Greer died by his own hand or someone else's, he's gone. His empire is finished. The settlers are safe. Thomas's death wasn't for nothing. But it feels hollow." "I know." Caleb took her hands. "But sometimes that's how justice works. It's not clean or satisfying or complete. It's just enough. Enough to let people move forward. Sarah nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. What happens now? Now we go home, Caleb said. We finish building. We live. We remember Thomas. And we make sure his dream survives. The journey back to Reed's Landing was subdued. Judge Holloway had indeed dismissed the case, accepting Greer's confession as authentic and declaring the matter resolved. The territorial governor issued a statement confirming that all of Greer's land claims were being reviewed, and the settlers' deeds were officially recognized as valid. It was victory, technically, but it felt incomplete. Sarah rode in silence most of the way, lost in thoughts Caleb couldn't begin to guess. Silas muttered about the strangeness of it all, his legal mind unable to accept the convenient resolution. Doyle remained vigilant, watching for threats that never materialized. And Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won the battle but missed something important, some larger truth that Greer's death had buried along with him. They reached Reed's Landing on the fourth day, arriving at sunset. The settlement had grown even in their brief absence. More homes stood completed, smoke rising from chimneys. The schoolhouse was finished, with children's drawings visible through the windows. And the community center, the church, stood tall and white against the darkening sky, its bell tower silhouetted like a promise. The settlers poured out to greet them, surrounding the wagon with questions and embraces. Martha pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. Daniel grabbed Caleb's hand, chattering excitedly about everything that had happened while they were gone. We finished the church, and Mr. Jacob made real pews. And my ma says we're having a dedication ceremony next Sunday. Caleb looked at the building, at the faces of the people gathered around it. They were celebrating. They'd heard about Greer's death, about the confession, about the victory. They didn't know it felt hollow. They didn't need to. Sarah climbed onto the wagon so everyone could see her. Thank you, she called out. Thank you all for your faith, your courage, your refusal to give up. Thomas would be so proud of what we've built here. Cheers erupted. People clapped and whistled. Children jumped up and down with excitement. Elias Greer is dead, Sarah continued. His confession has been accepted. Our land is legally and officially ours. We won. More cheers, but Caleb saw something in Sarah's expression, a sadness beneath the smile, a knowledge that victory wasn't always what you imagined it would be. She raised her hands for quiet. Tomorrow, we continue building. We plant. We grow. We create the future Thomas envisioned, and we never forget the price that was paid for it. The crowd dispersed slowly, families drifting back to their homes. Caleb helped unhitch the horses and unload the wagon. As he worked, Jacob approached. Good to have you back, the old carpenter said. We could use your help. Got a new family arriving tomorrow. They'll need a house built before winter. I'll be there, Caleb said. Jacob studied him. You don't look like a man who just won. I'm not sure what winning looks like anymore. It looks like this. Jacob gestured to the settlement. Families safe, children playing, homes being built. That's what winning looks like, not always satisfying, but real. He walked away, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. That night, Caleb sat on the porch of the small house the settlers had built for him during his absence. It was simple. One room, a bed, a table, a chair. But it was his, a place to belong. Sarah found him there, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might want company, she said, settling into the chair beside him. They sat in silence, sipping coffee, watching the settlement settle into sleep. Lanterns flickered out one by one. The sounds of conversation faded. A peaceful quiet descended. Do you think he really killed himself? Sarah asked eventually. No, Caleb said. I think someone got to him, someone who wanted him silenced. Who? I don't know. Maybe another business partner who didn't want their involvement revealed. Maybe someone Greer owed money. Maybe someone we'll never identify. Caleb paused. Does it matter? I don't know, Sarah admitted. I wanted him to face trial, to be publicly judged, to know that his victims had won. She sighed. But maybe Jacob's right. Maybe winning just means we're still here, still building, still refusing to let evil define us. Thomas would say something like that. He would. Sarah smiled sadly. He always saw the bigger picture, always believed that doing the right thing mattered more than the outcome. They fell silent again. What will you do now? Caleb asked. I'll keep building, help the new families settle in, make sure the school thrives, live the life Thomas and I planned. She looked at him. What about you? I'm staying. I told Doyle I would, and I meant it. As what? A farmer? A carpenter? As whatever the settlement needs. Caleb smiled faintly. Doyle offered me a deputy marshal position. Once we get a town charter, it'll be official. Marshal Vance, Sarah said, testing the words. It fits. Maybe. Will you ever preach again? The question caught him off guard. I don't know. That man, the one who stood in pulpits and talked about faith and redemption, I'm not sure he exists anymore. I think he does. I think he's just scared to come back. Caleb looked at her. You sound like someone else who said that to me recently. Because it's true. Sarah set down her cup. You've spent 7 years running from who you were. But who you were wasn't weak or foolish. He was a man who believed in something bigger than himself. And that man is still in there. Even after everything I've done. Especially after everything you've done. Because you chose to become better. You chose to protect instead of destroy. You chose to build instead of tear down. She touched his hand gently. That's not running from who you were. That's becoming who you were meant to be. Caleb had no answer for that. He sat with her words, turning them over in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe the man he'd been and the man he'd become weren't different people, but the same person at different points on the same journey. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing differently in the present. I should go, Sarah said, standing. Long day tomorrow. Sarah, Caleb said, thank you for everything. Thank me by staying, by being part of this community. That's all the thanks I need. She walked into the night, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and the quiet sounds of the settlement. He remained on the porch for a long time, watching stars wheel overhead, thinking about the path that had led him here. From grief to rage to wandering to this. A place to belong, people who needed him, a purpose beyond survival. It wasn't what he'd expected, wasn't what he'd been looking for during those 7 years of drifting, but maybe it was what he'd needed all along. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Caleb helped build homes for incoming families, his carpentry skills improving under Jacob's patient instruction. He organized security patrols, teaching settlers basic defensive tactics while hoping they'd never need them. He settled disputes, mediated conflicts, became the person people turned to when problems arose. He became, without quite meaning to, a leader. The settlement continued to grow. By mid-autumn, they had 30 families, a functioning school, a general store operated by a widow who'd arrived with her 3 sons. Someone started a blacksmith shop. Someone else opened a small medical clinic. Reed's Landing was becoming a real town. The church held its first official service on a Sunday in October. Silas Boone led it, reading from scripture and talking about perseverance and faith and the importance of community. The building was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls. Caleb sat in the back, as always. But this time, when Silas announced a hymn, Caleb found himself singing along. The words came back to him, muscle memory from a lifetime ago, and his voice joined the others in rough harmony. After the service, Daniel bounded over. Mr. Vance, you sang! I heard you! Just a little, Caleb said. Mrs. Reed says you used to lead singing. Will you do it sometime? I don't know about that. Please, we need someone who knows all the words. Caleb looked at Sarah, who was watching with knowing eyes. We'll see, he told Daniel. Maybe someday. The boy grinned and ran off. Sarah approached, smiling. Making progress, she observed. Small steps. Small steps count. That afternoon, Caleb walked to the edge of the settlement where they'd established a cemetery. It was small still, just a few graves, including Thomas Reed's. Someone had carved a proper headstone, simple but dignified. Thomas Reed. Beloved. Husband and father. He believed in justice. Caleb stood before the grave for a long time, hands in his pockets, thinking about the man he'd never met, but whose legacy had changed his life. I'm staying, Caleb said quietly, feeling foolish for talking to a grave but needing to say it anyway. I'm going to help protect what you started. Make sure your dream survives. The wind rustled through the grass, the only response. Caleb turned to leave and nearly collided with an older woman he didn't recognize. She was in her 70s, thin and weathered, with eyes that had seen hard years. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Marshall Doyle. I was told he comes through here sometimes." "He does. Should be here in a few days. Can I help you with something?" The woman hesitated. "I have information about Elias Greer's death." Caleb's attention sharpened. "What kind of information?" "The kind that might interest people who don't believe he killed himself." She glanced around nervously. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Caleb led her to his house. Once inside, she introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, formerly a housekeeper at Greer's ranch. "I left after he was arrested," she explained. "Couldn't stomach working there anymore, knowing what he'd done. But before I left, I overheard something." "What?" "Two men talking. They worked for Greer's lawyer, Mr. Whitmore. They were discussing how to handle the problem of Greer potentially testifying further, potentially revealing other people's involvement." Caleb leaned forward. "Did they say what they planned?" "Not explicitly, but one of them said, once he's gone, the whole thing dies with him. And the other laughed and said, confessions are easy to obtain when a man knows his family will suffer otherwise." Caleb's blood ran cold. Greer had family? A sister in Kansas City, children he never acknowledged publicly. Whitmore knew about them. Margaret's hands trembled. "I think they threatened Greer's family, made him write that confession, and then—" She couldn't finish. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I read about the trial, about the settlers who stood up to him, about Mrs. Reed." Her eyes glistened. "I worked in that house for 15 years. I saw what Greer did to people. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid. Now he's dead, and maybe I can't change that, but I can at least tell the truth about how it happened." Caleb studied her carefully. "Would you testify to this? If there was an investigation?" "If it meant justice, yes. I would." "Wait here," Caleb said. "I need to get Marshall Doyle." He found Doyle at the saloon in Ember Flats nursing a whiskey. When Caleb explained what Margaret had revealed, the marshal's expression turned grim. "If this is true, Whitmore orchestrated a murder and made it look like suicide," Doyle said. "That's a hanging offense. Can we prove it?" "With her testimony and an investigation into Whitmore's associates, maybe. It won't be easy. Whitmore's connected, powerful, but—" Doyle stood. "It's worth trying." They rode back to Reed's Landing together. Margaret repeated her story, and Doyle took detailed notes. "I'll take this to Judge Holloway," he said. "Request a formal investigation. It might not go anywhere, but at least the attempt will be made." "Thank you, Marshal," Margaret said. After she left, Doyle looked at Caleb. "You know this might not change anything, right? Even if we prove Whitmore was involved, Greer's still dead. The case is still closed." "I know," Caleb said, "but Sarah deserves to know the truth. They all do." "Truth doesn't always bring peace." "No? But it's better than lies." Doyle nodded. "I'll do what I can." He left at dawn, taking Margaret with him, and Caleb returned to the work of building, of protecting, of living. Winter came to the frontier with snow and bitter cold. The settlement prepared carefully, stockpiling food, reinforcing homes, ensuring every family had enough firewood to last until spring. The school continued despite the weather, children bundled in coats and scarves, learning reading and arithmetic while frost painted patterns on the windows. Caleb spent the winter months helping where he was needed, repairing roofs damaged by snow, hunting game to supplement food stores, keeping watch during storms when visibility dropped to nothing. And on Sundays, he went to church. Silas had stepped down from leading services, his health failing as winter deepened. The settlement needed a new minister, but no one had volunteered. Until one Sunday in January when Caleb stood up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice carrying across the silent church. "If you'll have me." Sarah looked at him with surprise and something like joy. The congregation murmured, then someone started clapping. Others joined in. And so Caleb Vance, former preacher turned bounty hunter turned protector, returned to the pulpit. His first sermon was simple. He talked about second chances. about how the frontier was full of people running from their pasts, trying to become something better, about how community meant accepting each other's failures and helping each other grow. He didn't quote much scripture. He didn't preach fire and brimstone. He just spoke honestly about what he'd learned, what he'd lost, and what he'd found again in this settlement. When he finished, people filed out quietly, shaking his hand, thanking him. Daniel hugged his leg and declared it the best sermon ever, even though Caleb suspected the boy had slept through half of it. Sarah was the last to leave. "Welcome back," she said simply. "I'm not who I was," Caleb said. "No, you're better." Spring arrived with thawing snow and the first green shoots pushing through mud. Doyle returned in April, looking tired but satisfied. He brought news. Judge Holloway had opened an investigation into Clarence Whitmore based on Margaret Hayes' testimony. Several of Whitmore's associates had been questioned, and one had broken, confirming that Whitmore had indeed arranged Greer's death to prevent further testimony. Whitmore had been arrested and was awaiting trial. "It won't bring Greer back," Doyle said. "Won't change what happened. But at least the man responsible is facing justice." Sarah received the news with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you for not giving up." "Thank Margaret Hayes. She's the one who had the courage to speak up." That Sunday, Caleb included Margaret in his sermon, talking about how justice sometimes came from unexpected places, from people who chose courage over safety. The settlement continued to grow. More families arrived as word spread about Reed's Landing, a place where the law mattered, where people helped each other, where you could build a life without fear. By summer, they had enough people to apply for an official town charter. Elections were held, and Sarah Reed was voted mayor by overwhelming majority. She appointed Caleb as town marshal, making official what had been his role for months. He wore the badge with a mix of pride and humility, understanding that it represented not just authority, but responsibility. A promise to protect, to serve, to uphold the law fairly and without favor. One evening in late summer, Caleb stood on the ridge overlooking Reed's Landing, watching the sun set over the settlement he'd helped build. The church stood at the center, white and proud. Around it, homes stretched in organized rows, smoke rising from chimneys. The school was letting out, children spilling into the street, their laughter carrying on the wind. The general store was busy with people buying supplies. The blacksmith's hammer rang rhythmically. It looked like a town. A real town. Not just a dream or a hope, but something solid and lasting. Sarah joined him, as she often did during these quiet moments. "Thinking," she asked. "Remembering," Caleb said. "Remembering what this place looked like when I first rode in. Just wagons and tents, and people terrified they were going to lose everything. And now? Now it's home." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the town settle into evening. "I've been thinking about Thomas," Sarah said eventually, "about what he would think if he could see this. He'd be proud." "I think so too." She paused. "I've also been thinking about you, about how you came here looking for one thing and found something completely different." "What was I looking for?" "I don't know. Maybe just a reason to keep going. Maybe proof that the world could still be good." Caleb considered that. "And did I find it?" Sarah smiled. "I think you did. I think you found more than that. I think you found yourself again." She was right, Caleb realized. Somewhere between the trial and the building, between the fighting and the preaching, between the running and the staying, he'd become someone he could live with again. Not the man he'd been before the fire. That man was gone forever, burned away with everything else he'd loved. But a new man. One who'd seen the worst of himself and chosen to become better. One who'd faced the darkness and refused to let it win. One who'd learned that justice wasn't always clean or complete, but it was still worth fighting for. One who'd discovered that faith wasn't about knowing all the answers. It was about choosing to believe anyway, even when belief was hard. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, on any of us." Sarah took his hand and squeezed it. "We don't give up on family, and that's what we are now. All of us. Family." Below them, the church bell began to ring. Not a call to service, but the evening bell Sarah had instituted, reminding people to come home for dinner, to gather with their families, to be grateful for another day. The sound carried across the prairie clear and strong, marking time and territory and hope. Caleb listened until the last echo faded, then walked with Sarah back down to the town they'd built from ashes and determination. Tomorrow, there would be work to do. Houses to build, disputes to settle, sermons to prepare. The endless tasks of community, of civilization, of life. But tonight, there was just this: the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. No longer running, no longer lost, just home. And for Caleb Vance, former preacher, former bounty hunter, current marshal, and minister of Reed's Landing, that was more than enough. It was everything.